Look, welcome. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for all those people on the live stream as well. This is the second of our Future of Work series events. So we have a similar lineup, some new faces and some familiar faces from the first event. I just want to start by doing a very quick introduction to everybody. So about Armstrong Craven. So we are 30 years old. I think we're 31 years old now, and we are a talent research and executive search business. And essentially what that means is we help our clients solve their talent problems whilst at the same time making sure they make best use of their own internal resources. So as far as our executive search service lines go, we identify talent populations, we help clients outreach and engage with passive talent, and where necessary we will help support them right through to hire. The other part of our business, which is more relevant probably within the HR community, is we help TA and HR leaders answer the questions they actually just can't answer themselves because they don't have the capacity or the information internally to be able to do it. So that's our talent research and talent consultancy business. Always very client specific questions, and always with an element of primary research going with our desk-based research. So some of the more recent projects that we've been asked to do for clients is, where will all the data scientists be in 2025? Who knows? We could have made that up in truth because nobody knows yet. But we think it was a pretty robust piece of work and the client seemed pretty happy with it. We had one of our clients in the last 18 months, no surprises, saying to us, can you help us work out what's going on with our vaccines teams? We're losing people out of our vaccines teams across our 6 global locations, and we're not quite sure why. Again, really relevant to that organisation in the current climate, and we know that helped them develop a board strategy for retention of that particular cohort of their talent. So it really is in that questions that people just can't find the answers to themselves. That's where we help out. So that's us. That's all you get on us. You'll all be pleased to know. That's probably 90 seconds worth on Armstrong Craven. On to the future work. This isn't just about hybrid working. There's an awful lot of commentary around hybrid working that you'll all see everywhere you go at the moment. And this isn't a conversation, contrary to a lot of popular opinion, that started on the 31st of December 2019 in a place called Wuhan in China, which none of us had ever heard of before then. What was reported on that day and everything that followed just accelerated a conversation that was already going on. So Cary and Stephen will probably tell you how many years they've been talking about this stuff. And they will probably tell you that the last 18 months has brought 10 years of progress in a lot of areas around the future of work and the future of workplace. So what's happened in the last 18 months? I think all the weaknesses of globalization and global supply chains have been exposed, hugely exposed. Climate change was a serious consideration for politicians. I think now it's a serious consideration for all of us in this room, for every business and every organisation. The awful, albeit not pandemic related, death of George Floyd brought diversity up the agenda, and something this time made it stick, whether that be the Black Lives Matter movement or whatever it was. That conversation seems to have stuck, and we've seen that right across, particularly in the US, but we've seen that around diversity initiatives really being much more strongly supported over the last 18 months than they ever have been before. Then we get onto things like robotic process automation, which I have to say slowly, and AI. So those applications are being explored in places they never have been before. And then ESG is another, again, relatively new term to a lot of us. I mean, its constituent parts have been around, but ESG is now a big topic of conversation, particularly in the boardroom. And there are more than a few investors that are challenging boards around their progress on ESG at the moment. And then just to top it all off, to make it all just that little bit more complicated, there's instant online feedback. So there's Glassdoor. Your millennials will tell you what they think before you even know you thought it. We have a few in our business, and they teach us things every day, much of which is good, much of which is terrifying for a man of a certain age. And we'll all have to adapt. The reality is we will all have to adapt. We've spent quite a bit of time in events with Evanta, their CHRO summits, and I know a couple of the people we met at the London event are here today. One of the things that came out of that event in early September was people kept looking to HR for the answers, and HR kind of went, oh, we don't really know the answers. Nobody really knows the answers to these things. But what we do know is everything has progressed at an incredible pace. Call centres went fully remote in 48 hours. And I suspect there's HR people in this room that probably spent years and years and years being told that's not possible. And guess what? It is. Retail stores became warehouses for online sales. I know a couple of retailers, I know book retailers, suddenly their stores were dark warehouses. And we all had to get to grips with the rules and regulation changes that seemed at one point to be weekly, if not daily. There were some good things about the pandemic, dare I say. Flexible working, more time with the family. And there were some bad things. More time with the family. As ever, depends on your perspective. So today, what we want to do is share some of the lessons that have been learned by our panel. And we're going to have some thoughts and ideas and reflections from Microsoft. So Joel's joined us from Microsoft and will tell us how they're dealing with some of these challenges in their organisation. But to start off with, we're going to have Cary and Stephen. So Professor Sir Cary Cooper, to give him his full title, is going to talk about the why and the what of workplace wellbeing. And then Stephen's going to talk about hybrid working and productivity. So Cary, I'll introduce you and I'll let you go.
Thank you very much. You're not going to have any trouble with my Mancunian accent, are you? When we did it in Manchester, they understood me perfectly. Okay, what I'm going to talk about today is something none of you have experienced. Stress at work, well-being, because you're 9-to-5ers, have a couple hours off for lunch every day at work or at home now. Forget work. Do you remember work? It's a place we used to go to. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk about well-being and look at it strategically. What is it? And why are people going into the well-being arena? So let's start here. And these were the figures that came out the year before COVID hit us in March of 2020. And these are the HSE figures on stress at work. And if you look at, don't look at all the detail here, look at that round circle on the right, 57% of all long-term sickness absence was for anxiety, depression, stress. Huge numbers, only 25% for musculoskeletal in those days, which used to be 10 to 15 years ago, the number one issue. So that's one of the bottom line issues that we have. But not only are we concerned about sickness absence, but we should also be concerned about presenteeism. You know what it is, don't you? How many of you know what it is? Okay, so what is it? Sorry? I need to be seen, right? So it's not just about sickness presenteeism, not just going to work when you're ill, it's just being seen. And when the Sainsbury Center for Mental Health was looking at this just before the financial crisis, the economists came up with this figure that it was double the cost of absenteeism, people being present, but not necessarily delivering because they're either ill, job dissatisfied or whatever, but they're showing FaceTime. And you tend to get this in recessions, big time. And we got it in the pandemic, funny enough, presenteeism as well, because we had people sending emails all times of the day to their boss to share, I'm committed. Hey, you're not seeing me, but boy, I'm here. I'm really working hard. And the evidence that started to mount was that people were working actually longer hours during the pandemic. And when do you remember the Prime Minister, a guy called Boris Johnson, when he said, go back to work because you haven't been, implying we haven't been working, right? We'd actually been working harder and longer during that. Partly, by the way, because we hadn't figured out how to work in that kind of scenario. You're working exclusively from home, which is what nobody wanted pre-pandemic anyway, right? So that was kind of one of, and the other one was we're worried about our jobs unconsciously and wanted to show our boss that we're at the helm and we're doing the kind of stuff. But we did a big study. I did a big study where we looked at 39,000 people, represented a sample throughout the UK, and we're trying to look at presenteeism in the context of this. And because what we all want is the top left-hand box, don't we? We all want healthy people and they're present. Then there's unhealthy people, the sickness presenteeism business. How often do you come to work ill, right? As a measure. Then there are healthy people, not always present, the job dissatisfied. I'm healthy and everything, but boy, please, leaves on the line. Anything, any excuse so I don't have to go to work because I'm not really happy there. And then there's unhealthy and not always present. They either have a chronic condition or stress or something like that. So let me ask you, you're all HR people, what proportion of people do you think go in the top box? What percentage go in the healthy and present? People who are healthy, present, motivated. In a study we did of 39,000, just throw out a figure, percentage. 30%. Hey, that's pretty pessimistic, isn't it? Okay, go ahead. Anybody else? Anybody go higher? This is an auction here. 60% are healthy and present. Okay, anybody else? You were close. So only a third of people are paying my pension, right? Isn't that sad? That means 1 in 3 of our colleagues are present, motivated, and there, and producing the goodies. 28% regularly, because the way we defined it is regularly going to work ill. And that's nearly 30%. That's pretty high. 13% job dissatisfied. You know, I'm just totally, you know, my health is fine, but I hate my job. And then about 12% of the 24% was stress at work. You know, some absences, but health not very good. So presenteeism is a word. We now measure it. Most, you know, I have a University of Manchester spin-off company, and we measure presenteeism all the time in organizations. It's not a difficult thing to do. And if you look at the CIPD report, so I'm president of the CIPD until December. I've done it for 6 years. And if you look at it, you'll see presenteeism during the pandemic was rife, really high. People reporting back, telling their boss what the hell they were doing, showing I'm committed and all that, which is a form of presenteeism, really. Okay, I just thought if you want the slides, you can have these. That's why I give them to you. But this is the scary bit, the one at the top, that when the OECD was looking at all these the countries in terms of mental well-being, we lost in that particular year. They did it 4.5% of our GDP. If our GDP was 4.5%, I'd be very happy, right? So if we only had half of that back, so the management of mental health is a real problem for us as an economy. And by the way, it's not just us. We're not the only ones, but we don't do terribly well on this thing. If you look at the productivity per capita, it's in our book, which you have a free copy of, which Steve and I just got for the first time because our publisher didn't send it to us. So I want to thank you, Peter, very much for that. But if you look at our productivity per capita, we're tied bottom of the G7 on productivity per capita with Italy, and we're 17th in the G20 on productivity per capita. It's very bad. We're not good. We don't measure it well, by the way, anyway, and we are a service-based economy, so it's more difficult to measure it. But no matter how you measure it, we don't come out terribly well. Okay, so that tells you that. Now, what do we know? So I'm just going to give you a rough run through. And as an academic, I'm not supposed to say this, but we have more than enough research to know what causes people stress at work. There must be 20-some-odd thousand studies, good studies, not bad studies, good studies. And so we know this is a model which just tells us what the studies effectively say. The things on the left-hand side are the things that cause us the most stress at work. Okay, things like factors intrinsic to our job, the role you play, your relationships to work with your boss, your colleagues, your customers, your clients, whoever they are, your career development, the organization structure and climate, and finally home-work interface, how the home affects work and how work affects home. All right, and those kind of factors, I'll go one at a time after those. Those kind of factors influence you, the individual, which then, if it's high, if the stress levels are higher in your job, and in the nature of the job you do in the organization you work for, we'll have individual symptoms of it, and we have organizational symptoms. As an organizational psychologist, Steve and I probably get most of the stuff at the bottom. You know, organizations coming to us and saying, you know, our absence is high. But incidentally, we're now getting people coming to us and saying our presenteeism figures are high. And we have a lot of people turning up to work but delivering no added value. They're just not happy. Bunnies. So what do we do? You know, let's find out what's driving the presenteeism. Accidents, poor quality control, all that kind of stuff. The output measure, the organizational output measures are effective. And what our book does, by the way, is we did something a bit different, because most of the research in stress and well-being is usually about how those factors on the left influence your health or the organization's sickness absence rates or whatever. We've gone a step further in saying, if we're going to convince organizations to do something about it and do it strategically, then it has to have a performance or productivity element to it, right? If as a country we're not very good at productivity, then maybe we need to show that healthy, motivated people can deliver to the bottom line, right? And the CFO will understand that. HR already doesn't care because HR says, well, I'm concerned about the health and well-being of people, which is what you're concerned about. But increasingly HR is saying, hey, we have to convince other people who have the bucks, and we have to convince them by showing it can actually deliver to the bottom line. So that is important. So the model just says those factors on the left influence you. We have individual symptoms of it. We have organizational symptoms. And ultimately, we get disease as a result of those. Individual disease, stress and lack of well-being, mental well-being, is a risk factor to heart disease, mental health, and a whole range of illnesses. This sounds depressing, isn't it, for an afternoon? But anyway, you know that. I don't have to tell you that. You know people who've had heart attacks or immune system failures or whatever. And then the other thing is organizationally, you get frequent strikes, apathy, and stuff like that. And then there's one box that goes further to the right. It's 6 foot long and goes 6 foot down. And that's when stress causes, proper, and organizationally can cause problems. So really the model is quite simple. So what I want to do is take a look at each of the factors on the left and contemporize it with the pandemic, what we've just been through. So let's take a look at them. Okay. So every job has its own stress fingerprint. If you're in HR, in fact, I did a study for the CIPD. We did a study of about 5,000 HR professionals in the UK. And we were looking at its stress fingerprint. And there were things like too much work, hating doing the downsizing. HR hates that. It's the leading cause of sickness absence among HR people when we did ours. Do you remember that, Tony? We did that. Were you involved in that? I can't remember if you were. No, I think you were. But anyway, so we did this big trying to find out what causes HR problems. And some of these are the same things: too much work, too little work. And what you find in a recession, or the period we're going through now, which will, I think, turn into a recession gradually as the furloughing, stops and everything happens like that, we're likely to see more job loss. Because we hear the government saying we have 1.25 million jobs out there that people can take, right? And you HR people are prepared to drive a lorry to France, aren't you? Huh? Or to work in a pub. So the jobs that are available are not the jobs that people want to take, not English people or UK people want to take. So it's irrelevant what that is. If they're in the right sector, that's a different matter, but they're not. And that's the problem I think we're going to have. So I suspect we're going to have something like a recession over the coming year. It's not going to be particularly good news, and from that point of view. And Brexit's going to come in, and it has already come in terms of supply chain and the rest of it. So there's kind of issues associated in the future. So what I'm saying is people are going to feel slightly less secure than they have in the past. So the issue of too little work becomes a big issue here. I love this book. Have you ever heard of Joseph Heller? How many of you read Catch-22? Raise your hand. You know it. Okay. The first book he ever wrote was something called Something's Happened, before he wrote Catch-22. And it was a book about his experience working in an insurance company. And the book was about somebody having a stress breakdown, the whole book. And it was really funny. It was funny, but if you read Catch-22, it's also really moving. But listen to this. So one of his characters says in the book, this is a middle manager who has not much to do. All right? And he says, I am bored with my work very often now. Everything routine that comes in, I pass along to somebody else. This makes my boredom worse. It's a real problem to decide whether it's more boring to do something boring than to pass along everything boring to somebody else and have nothing to do at all. So, too little work can be a problem, particularly in a recession. So we have that kind of an issue. Time pressures, mistakes, too many decisions. I think another factor intrinsic to our work life now, which is a new factor, which is what we call techno stress, emails and the like. So I run something called the National Forum for Health and Wellbeing at Work, which Nick from John Lewis Partnership is in it, 40 global employers. Microsoft is in it, by the way, as well. Okay, we have all these fairly senior people, usually HR directors, chief medical officers, directors of health and wellbeing for these major companies. The big issue for them, the number one issue when we met 3 years ago, when we started meeting quarterly, but we now meet almost monthly, is the big issue was the line manager, which I'll talk about in a minute, from a well-being perspective. The second biggest issue, they said, when we were trying to get the science on it, was email overload. The people's private life is being destroyed. So let's find out from you guys. How many of you do emails when you come home from work, sometime during the night, doing your work emails? Raise your hands. Hi. Yeah. There isn't anybody except the Microsoft guy. You should be doing the emails because that's your goddamn business. Okay, all right, so do that. How many of you, when you first get up in the morning, look at your emails? Raise your hands. How many? Oh, geez, you're all terrible. You're HR. How many of you actually do your emails but you don't do this while you're on holiday? Is this pathetic? Is this pathetic? That's why the French introduced the right to disconnect law 2 years ago. It says no manager can send an email out of office hour to their subordinates. Who was it, Steve? This week, another country just passed the law. Portugal. I love Portugal. That's why I'm going to continue to go to Portugal. Portugal's passed the law on that too. And I think the EU is considering it right now as a EU-wide law, that they're right to disconnect, that your managers, but I don't think that's good if we're having flexible work. If we have hybrid working and you're picking up the kids from school at 3:30, right? And then you want to be with them, read with them, and then you want to do work at night, and you close down like Volkswagen do. They close down their server at 5:30, and it doesn't turn it on till the next morning. They also, one of the other ones, one of the German car manufacturers, closes it down. As soon as you log out for holidays, you're closed down. Stops, and it says it doesn't turn it on until you get back to work. I think that's not the way to do it, but we do need guidance on this, don't we? We do need to think through how we do it. And managers shouldn't send emails. In particular, what I really hate when I hear a manager say to me, yeah, Cary, you're right. I don't overload my direct reports at all. So on a Friday afternoon, I'll send an email out and I'll say, don't answer here's what I need information on Monday sometime, but don't answer it. So why are you sending the goddamn thing in the first place, right? That is dumb. Just don't send it at all till Monday morning, because that person, there's going to be people who worry. And therefore, I got to get this done. So I'm sorry, dear. I'm now working on that thing. So too little work, too much work. Every job is different, okay? I'll just give you an example. One of the first studies I ever did was at Manchester Airport. I was looking at air traffic controllers. And I remember taking my PhD student with me, who was going to interview them. We were taking blood chemistry of all the air traffic controllers and trying to see if we could predict what factors at work like these could predict their risk to heart disease, because I don't want one of those guys while I'm flying off to Portugal to be having this kind of issue. Anyway, and we did. I'll never forget when I walked up to the pilot. We went up to the air traffic controller and stood behind, and I was going to teach my PhD student how to do the interview. And the guy turned around, he had 2 cigarettes in his mouth. And I thought, yeah, this is it. But actually, they're not a very high risk job, strangely enough, because they're looked at by the CAA every 6 months, their health, and now mental health. In those days, they didn't particularly look at their mental health too much, but they look at all sorts of things. But these are the kind of risk factors you'll get for that. But every job is different. University lecturers are going to be different from HR directors and so on, or HR people. The role you play in your organization, how much control and autonomy? This is what you in your trade call employee engagement. And you've been measuring, how many of you still measure employee engagement? Raise your hand again. It's rubbish though, why are you doing it? I don't understand why you do it. I mean, you know what you do? You see a firm comes out and they do it and they say, hey, we've really improved here. From 80% of people, we're now at 81.5 or to 82%. I mean, what is it telling you? But it's only one part of the well-being structure. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying in HR, everybody went for the magic bullet of employee engagement as the thing that's going to change it and make a well-being culture. It didn't. It didn't at all. It's almost as good as sushi at your desk, bean bags, and the well-being day where you have smoothies. I mean, it's just, and it's nice, all of those, and I like the massagers at my desk, don't get me wrong, but it's not the magic bullet. And I think we have to understand that. So the role you play, I think, is really important. I love this. This is from Heller too, and I better get on with it. Otherwise my colleague will kill me. Okay, how do you like this one? This is Heller's book, a middle manager who talks about his role. He says, what would happen if deliberately and calmly, with malice aforethought and obvious premeditation, I disobeyed? I know what would happen. Nothing. Nothing would happen. The knowledge depresses me. I suppose it's just about impossible for someone like me to rebel anymore and produce any kind of lasting effect. I have lost the power to upset things that I had as a child. I can no longer change my own job or the environment or even disturb it. They would simply fire and forget me as soon as I try. That's kind of lack of control. Control is an issue. That's a big issue. Not just engagement, but how much autonomy and control people have in their job. I did a big study for the BDA, British Dental Association. We found these kind of factors. Interesting, you think that if you were a dentist, the thing that would cause you the most stress in your job would be looking into somebody's mouth for such a period of time. It's horrible. Standing up all day long? No, it was all relationship problems. How do I manage people? The biggest single predictor was patients perceiving me as an inflictor of pain, would you believe? But it's a relationship thing. Managing the patient, managing the practice, administrative duties. They were all people that had nothing to do with what you'd think it would be technically. So it's really important to understand a job. Is sometimes you find something you never expected when you're doing research, looking at what are the factors for a particular occupation. Relationships with boss, important. Relationship with colleagues. The most important is the boss, in my view. The National Forum for Health and Wellbeing for years, right, Tony? We've been talking, the first issue we had was the line manager. If we could do one thing, we said, and these were HR directors, chief medical officers, directors of health, the one big thing is getting more EQ'd line managers from shop floor to top floor. What do? We promote people and recruit them based on their technical skills, not their people skills. Until we get parity between the both, we're in trouble. This really has to happen, which means we need more women in management jobs all the way through the system because they have more EQ than men have. Either we do that or we train the men to be not so just technically orientated and do something about it. What I think we need to do, by the way, in this space is not only when we recruit them or we promote them, we have to find a way of measuring their EQ so that they have to have and social interpersonal skills. We can do that. It's not going to be too complicated. And just say there has to be parity between the two. Technical skills, not enough. And that the UK needs, I think, really important. Last Heller quote, and then I'll keep my mouth shut and rush through this. Okay. Opening paragraph of the book, Heller's book. I love this. He was wonderful. In the office in which I work, there are 5 people of who I am afraid. Each of these 5 people is afraid of 4 people, excluding overlaps, for a total of 20. Each of these 20 people is afraid of 6 people, making a total of 120 people who are feared by at least one person. In my department, there are 6 people who are afraid of me, and one small secretary is afraid of all of us. I have one other person working for me who's not afraid of anyone, not even me, and I'd fire him quickly, but I'm afraid of him. The thought occurs to me often there must be male clerks, assistants, messengers of all kinds of ages who are afraid of everyone in the company. And there's a typist in our department who's going crazy slowly and has all of us afraid of her. Her name is Martha. Our biggest fear, she'll go crazy on a weekday between 9 to 5. We hope she'll go crazy on a weekend when we aren't with her. Now, it's humorous, but it's about relationships, and relationships are fundamental, and particularly your boss. Bosses are fundamental. If they manage you by praise and reward, as opposed to fault finding, if they create the right kind of structure, if they're emotionally literate, if they know you have unmanageable workloads, unrealistic deadlines, that's the fundamental. I think all of us working in this thing say that is the building block. That's the one thing we should do, which means HR, you guys and gals, what you have to do, I think, is look at your cadre of all line managers all the way up the system and say, those 30%, fine. They have it naturally, keep them, they're great, okay? Those 40% are technically very good, are trainable. Those 20%, put them in a little room with their machine, but take them away from human beings. And I literally mean that. I mean, let them do their function and pay them well to do that function. But there are some people who are just untrainable in this regard. And we just have to accept the reality. Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere. Okay, next one. Over promotion, under promotion, lack of job security. Big issue. We could see this during the financial crisis. Look what happened. Take a look at the figures on September 2000. This was by the CMI, Chartered Management Institute, the economists there. You can see very insecure. We're going to get that again, by the way, during this period of time, post-pandemic, job insecurity levels. This happened during the financial crisis. I found this in the Buffalo News. I love it. The bad news, Johnson, is you're being let go. This is the boss. The good news, you can have your old job back at half your former pay. I can't live on that. The rest of the good news, we can offer you a second job, also at half your former pay. Look at the bottom says, I'd offer you a third, but I'm afraid of overheating the economy. But you get the message, insecurity is coming. This is another factor, organization structure and climate. What kind of an organization do you have? For people who, like Steve and I, when we go into organizations, do audits or well-being things, you can get a sense of what the culture is like. Even within a company, that culture is fine, but that one is pretty problematic. Work-life interface, this has been a big issue for quite a long time. And this is something I was just talking about the people at the table over there about. See, I'm worried about hybrid working. Here's what I'm worried about. I'm worried that gender inequality is going to occur. Let me tell you what I think is going to happen. I think what's going to happen is men whose identity is primarily about work and secondarily about the family, and women tend to be concerned about both equally. Men will gravitate to work more hours in the workplace, more days in the workplace than women, because they have the primary responsibility for kids and elder care and the rest of it. What will happen is because they're not visible and not there and not playing organizational politics, will not get promoted as much as men will. And I really worry about that. And we'll see what happens when this comes along. But it's certainly an issue I think we have to be cognizant of. And I just hope men over the last 18 months have learned something. You know, first of all, they can now remember the names of their kids. That's for starters, and that they really engage with their children, and maybe they feel family life is quite important. And maybe the fact that people are leaving jobs, after the reflection of 18 to 20 months, maybe men have got something, maybe they've learned something. I'm praying that we have all learned something during this period of time, and that they will understand that they have a role in the family as well as just being, a workaholic. But so I'm getting to the end, Steve, honestly. Okay, so what do we do about all this? All right, well-being now, by the way, is big. How many of you have somebody in your organization who's at a senior level responsible for health and well-being, at a senior level? That's not that many. Not that many. Okay. By senior, I mean HRD level, that kind of level. That's good. Pre-COVID, the year before COVID hit, for March 20, I got a phone call from the leading recruitment firm in the United States who recruits chief executives and CFOs of the big global American companies. Called me up and said, we've read your work, Professor Cooper. I just want to ask you a question. We've had a half a dozen people come to us, companies, saying they want to hire in a chief well-being officer, equivalent to an HR director, an HRD, or a CFO, equivalent to that, at the senior leadership team table. And one of them wants a NED on the board, who's well-being and responsible. And I thought that was really interesting. So can you tell me what the role is? We've never had this before. Help me identify tell me the job spec. What is this role? Okay. And by the way, the National Forum is currently doing that right now. We now feel that all companies and public sector bodies should have a non-executive director who's responsible entirely for health and well-being. And that person ought to have metrics to determine whether the organization is is doing the business and be held accountable. Because we just had a meeting, Nick, and we're now trying to identify what are the metrics that it should be. What are the things we should judge this person should be looking at and then saying to the board, or at least to the senior leadership team, minimally. So that's really, I think, where we're going to be going for that. So I think if we're to make this a strategic, if it's going to be beyond mindfulness at lunch, right? And smoothies on a well-being day. And really that is not what well-being is. So I think this has become, now there are companies, a number of companies now, which the senior leadership, the chief executive, Mace, the builder, perfect example. Every quarter, somebody reports on what's going on with health and well-being with stats. This is what we did on well-being, the interventions we did, this is the impact that's had. Boom. 10 minutes? No, 1 hour. I've been there, I've been to the board and done that myself with them. This is the way we're going to have to move, and this is the way a good company or public sector body should go in the future. This is really kind of critical. But the strategy has to be one where we find out from people how they perceive the organization, well-being audits, the instruments are out there. My university spin-off company does this all the time with big, huge companies. It's not a problem to do it. Well-being audits. From that, you build a structure to figure out what we need to do. And that part of the business is a glass ceiling for women. That part, it's an abusive management style. And that part, it's a long hours culture. And that part goes on. And you find out by doing these well-being audits on a regular basis. And you do something about it, and you build a structure up, and you train line managers on EQ, and it becomes more strategic, and therefore you're solving the problem rather than covering it up with mindfulness at lunch. All right? Secondarily, which I think you all do anyway, which is, you probably do some kind of resilience training. How do you help the individual? You train the individual. That's part of a well-being structure as well. These are all make up a well-being thing. Employee voice, well-being audit. Training where it's needed, because the thing tells you where you need the training. And then you have the safety net of an employee assistance program to help people who can't cope. And there might be things that are happening outside. 60% of the people who report to an EAP have not a work-related problem, but a home-related problem. But they're bringing it into the work. I did this for the HSE. I evaluated all the EAPs in the UK. So I know that 60% of it has nothing to do with work, but 40% does. So that's what a comprehensive program would look. This I did for the EU. This is what a body we did. But if you look at the evidence in the well-being report in 2008 and the one that just came out in 2021, roughly the same thing. But still, 60% of organizations don't have a well-being strategy. They have somebody who does. Let's have well-being champions. I'll bet you all have well-being champions, right? Raise your hand. You all do. Yeah. I'll bet you also have mental health first aid. Yeah, you all do. Still, that's low-hanging fruit. I'm not saying that's not useful, because a PhD student of mine, or you're saying it's not useful. Well, I'll tell you, mental health first aid, funny enough, Steve, Susan did a study on that. Susanna Robertson, when she was at the BBC, and she found that actually it was effective. But there were problems with mental health first aid. Everybody does it, and there might be inappropriate people doing it. The training is crap. I mean, not as good as it could be, etc. There are problems with it. It should be people who should be screened, so you know who they are and that they don't have the wrong motivations for doing it, etc. And so on. But those are useful tools to have, well-being champions. It's engaging people and everything else, but it's a part of a wider strategy, a preventive strategy. Evidence from PwC, tons of evidence. It works. If you do it strategically, it works, but it's got to be done strategically. That's 55 companies they did. But well-being is not this. Tomorrow is the mandatory meeting for employee health and well-being. The boss says the meeting starts at 6 a.m., so it'll interfere with your sleep and not your work. Doesn't that send a message that work is more important than health? I hope so. That's the theme of the meeting. Healthy employees are unproductive. They're always exercising or eating fruit when they should be working. We prefer employees who work hard and die before their pensions start paying out. Suddenly I feel sick, right on schedule. That's not well-being. And so it's important that we look at it strategically. We're going to have hybrid working here, thank God. As Peter said, this pandemic has been brilliant for HR. This is your challenge. Where now people wanted to pre-COVID work flexibly, they've got it, except for Goldman Sachs. But let's not forget that for the time. There's probably somebody here from Goldman Sachs, and I'm in deep shit. Is there? No. Okay. Well, there are a few dinosaurs out there who are saying that everybody has to be in the office and can't go work flexibly. That's not the future, and they're going to lose all, my MBA students. Because that's not what the millennials want. That's not what they need. We have that. We know the line manager is significant. Why is the line manager significant? It's going to have to manage people who work in different contexts. It's going to have to look out for the mental health. Biggest single cause sickness, absence, mental health. They're going to have to look and be able to be socially sensitive to when somebody is showing signs of stress and mental ill health, which is the biggest leading cause. How are they going to do that when not everybody's in the office all the time? So that has accelerated the line manager, right? And for people like Peter and his business of recruiting for a management job, if you don't look at the people skills, we're going to have the same problems we've had on productivity for the next 10 years. So for every technical job, we have to have people management skills. That's going to be kind of fundamental. And I'll close with, I think I'm okay, just ready to finish. I'm just going to close with this. You think well-being is a relatively recent phenomenon? It's not. Who's the first person to ever mention this? It was a guy called Bobby Kennedy. Brilliant man. The best president the United States never had. He was assassinated, unfortunately, in my hometown of LA when he was running for the presidential nomination, Democratic nomination for president. Listen what he said. He did a speech at the University of Kansas in 1968, 2 weeks before he was assassinated. And his speech was entitled Gross National Well-Being, right? And he said, I'm not going to read the whole speech. You'll be pleased to hear. Too much and for too long, we seem to have surrendered personal excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things. Our gross national product now is $800 billion a year. That's now about 3 trillion, by the way. And that gross national product, if we judge the United States of America by that gross national product counts air pollution and cigarette production, and the ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. Remember what GDP is. They used to call it GNP, gross national product. We call it gross domestic. It's everything we produce. So bombs, we produce bombs still, right? Well, bombs are something we produce, so that adds in the GDP. So he said, so it counts air pollution and cigarette production, and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts the special locks for our doors and for the jails for the people who break them. It counts the destruction of the redwood and the loss of our natural wonder in the chaotic sprawl of our cities. And remember, this is around Vietnam time. It also counts napalm bombs and nuclear warheads and armored cars for the police to fight the riots in our cities. And remember, GDP is the indicator that we're a successful country, right? And he's trying to say something about that. So is this really a good indicator? He now says, yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages or our relationships, or the intelligence of our public debate, Boris Johnson, or the integrity of our public officials, Boris Johnson. He didn't say that, by the way. That's just me putting it in there. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. Powerful. And he was going in the right direction. And luckily, we're going in the right direction. We just have to make sure you buggers do your job. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Oh, hello. Thank you very much, Cary. Any questions for Cary before we release him?
We were just thinking about it, Peter. Should we? I'm trying to be flexible.
You are welcome to choose.
Why don't we do the questions in the hour?
Absolutely.
Is that okay with you?
That's absolutely fine with me.
Do you think that would be good? That way it gives you some time to do your talk without.
We'll do that. That's fine.
Is that okay?
If the room is happy, then that's fine. Right, yeah. Stephen, over to you. Thanks, Cary.
Okay.
Thanks to my warm-up act. Never fails to deliver. So hi everyone, I'm Stephen Bevan. I'm Head of HR Research and Development at the Institute for Employment Studies down in Brighton. We're a sort of weird hybrid organisation, so we're not a think tank, we're not an academic department, we're not a consultancy. We are a charity and we do a mix of applied research on the world of work, and we also do some not-for-profit consultancy, which is an interesting model, because we don't make a profit on it at all. We were established in 1969, and we have about 45 staff across a range of disciplines, so organisational psychology, HR, economics, and a few rogue lawyers. And our interest, I suppose, is in evidence-based practice, and we do work for government departments, employers, trade bodies, and so on. We're doing a lot of work, as you could imagine, during the last 18 months, looking at what the impact of the pandemic has been on sort of the world of work. We provide a sort of regular commentary around what's happening in the wider labour market, because a lot of talk about labour flows and vacancies and skill shortages and so on. So we try and look at what the data is actually saying and provide some commentary on that. We also do a lot of work on what's happening in real organisations, in workplaces, and what are the challenges that are being faced there. We're doing a piece of work jointly with Southampton Business School called Work After Lockdown, which started over a year ago now, and that's been tracking organisations and individuals through the pandemic. And if you just Google Work After Lockdown, you'll find the website for the project, and there's a few free reports and webinars and so on you can look at there. Well, we've been sort of trying to track how organisations have been managing, first of all, the transition to working from home, for example, and then the process of transitioning back into whatever the new normal is. But we also do work on a range of other things, so performance management, reward, and so on. Diversity inclusion. Today on our website, you'll see a new report out looking at diversity and inclusion in engineering, which includes the really worrying statistic that at the current rate of recruitment of women into engineering, it will take another 100 years until there's 50-50 men and women in the engineering sector. So slow progress. And loads of work on well-being at work. And we're doing quite a few projects looking at things like cancer at work. We're doing quite a lot of work on obesity and work on things like musculoskeletal health and mental health. I suppose what I'd say to follow on from what Cary was talking about is that the last 2 years have really intensified the debate about the ability of organisations to change and adapt, and we've seen some really incredible examples of that. There's been an increasing debate about the nature of what we call the psychological contract between an employer and their employees, and of course the ways that the future of work itself will evolve. And as Cary suggested, you could argue that COVID has been an accelerator of things that were sort of nascent before the pandemic, but which have really taken hold and organisations have had to embrace, partly as a coping strategy to deal with the pandemic, but also because in a sense it opened the door to initiatives that were really just in their infancy. So what I want to do this afternoon is to take a critical look at some of the sort of social and economic and technological forces that are likely to shape the future of work over the next decade or so. And as I do that, what I want to do is assess whether or not the changes that have been forced on us by the pandemic will result in a permanent shift in working patterns, employee preferences, and so on. But also want to take a more sober look, if you like, at the history of the future of work. Because there's been lots of breathy commentary around the future of work for decades, and most of it is wrong. And so I'm going to see whether or not we're closer than we have been historically to being able to foresee what the future is. And so in putting together the thoughts that I'm going to share with you, I've tried to address 3 questions. What are the main drivers of the dynamism which organisations have got to have or to develop post-COVID? A pretty fundamental question about whether or not we're seeing a revolution in the way that we work, or will things revert to some form of normal? And that goes for practices inside organisations, but also the labour market. And I'll be presenting some data to you that suggests that actually, despite all the churn and excitement in the labour market over the last 10 or 20 years, actually things have always tended to revert back to some fairly predictable patterns. And I'll be looking at whether or not that's going to happen this time. And then third, what are the big questions that HR professionals need to answer in response to those drivers and to changing employee expectations? So they're my 3 questions. And then what I want to do then is to see whether or not there are sort of big factors that are driving organisations' imperative to adapt and to change. And I'm going to focus on 4, but I fully recognise that there are several others that also equally have a big effect on the way that organisations are having to respond. So 2 obvious ones that I can think of are the whole shift towards environmental awareness and sustainability, which is certainly coming up very strongly on the rails as an issue that is preoccupying organisations, and of course diversity and inclusion for all the reasons that Cary mentioned. So I'm not saying by excluding them from this neat little graph of 4 things, I'm not saying they're not important, but these are the 4 that I think I'm going to focus on today. So let's have a look at demographics and health. Try not to overlap too much with what Cary was saying about well-being at work, but we'll talk about that a little bit too. So what's happening in the sort of world of demographics? I think one of the things that enables us to be reasonably confident about predicting aspects of the workforce is that ageing is just one of those things we can predict. We can predict birth rates and death rates, and we can do the sums, and we can work out, if you do things like change the retirement age, what does the working age population look like over the next 20 or 30 years? Now, it's been quite interesting because up until the pandemic, there were fairly confident predictions that, for example, over 65s in the UK labour market will account for almost 2/3 of employment growth to 2060. We just know that labour market participation rates have been very high amongst older workers and growing. And there's been a big drive by government over the last 20 years to increase participation, and that's largely been more successful. So, for example, retirement is no longer a cliff edge. It's a very porous transition that people make, and about 25% of people unretire within 5 years. So, the way we manage the end of our careers is perhaps something we ought to be looking at in a bit more detail. And we know that 1 in 10 men over 65 and 1 in 20 women over 65 are still working. And so, that part of the labour market has been transformed over the last few years. However, just in the last 18 months, we've seen quite a big shift in that figure, because about 500,000 older workers, people over 50, have come out of the labour market completely. There's been a big decline in labour market participation, and that's largely amongst older women. And the thing we don't know yet is to what extent that will bounce back, or whether it's something permanent. It may be that some occupations and some sectors that employ lots of women are experiencing a permanent shift into economic inactivity, and we're still not clear why that is. So one of the big questions is the progress that we've made in keeping older workers in the labour market has taken a bit of a hit during the recession, during the pandemic and the recession. To what extent is that going to recover, and what can we do about it? And obviously that plays into the wider debate about skill shortages, hard to fill vacancies, discontinuity of labour supply, I suppose, which has been affected by both the pandemic and also in some sectors by Brexit. So there's a bit of uncertainty there still. The other demographic thing we know about is birth rates. Obviously, that's looking a long way ahead in terms of future labour supply, but we know that from a demographic point of view, just very crudely, just to keep the population at a constant level, we need every woman of childbearing age to have 2.1 children. At the moment, it's 1.58. And so that's why, for example, that's part of the thinking behind Angela Merkel actually encouraging more and more migration a few years ago, because she recognised that there were going to be demographic problems that would lead to labour shortages. It was 2.93 children per woman in 1964, for example. So birth rates tend to fall as affluence grows, and one of the challenges is that if you look demographically, we're not producing the flow of labour that we're going to need over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Workforce health is a big issue, of course, and Cary has talked to you very eloquently about some of the challenges. We know that musculoskeletal conditions and mental health problems remain the dominant features of the problem in terms of both sickness absence and presenteeism. The last lot of data, so if you're a data geek like me and you look at sickness absence statistics, we're screwed, because how do we measure sickness absence in a pandemic? In 25 years' time, when we look back on 2020 and 2021, trying to find out what the trends were in sickness absence, they're going to be a big problem in the data. But the most recent data we have on these two health factors are that they account for about 31 million working days lost each year, and that's more than the number of days lost through strike action in 1979 during the winter of discontent. So, you know, the fact that that's happening in what is essentially an aging population is something we need to be wary of, and I'll show you a scary graph about that in a second. And obviously the link between workforce health and productivity, which is, I guess, the main theme of the book, is that labour supply has a big impact on the productive capacity of the workforce, and if it's an unhealthy workforce, that has a multiplying problem. And of course, what's tended to happen with productivity, and I'll talk about that this again in a minute, is that we've tended to think about productivity being a sort of a result of investing in skills and technology. And I think that one of the core arguments of the book is that productive capacity through health in the workforce is a sort of intangible asset that we're not really thinking about in that sense. And we need to do a lot more to make sure that we're thinking about the health of the workforce as a factor of production. So what do we know about the future of the health of the workforce? This is just a number of people in the UK working age population who will have a long-term health condition by 2030. By long-term conditions, we tend to mean symptoms that last more than 3 months. And you can see that mental illness and musculoskeletal conditions account for certainly much more than 50% of the total. And then we have a range of other conditions: asthma, cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, diabetes, coronary heart disease, and stroke. And of course, there are many others, MS, rheumatoid arthritis, and so on. And the key thing is that this represents about 42% of the working age population by 2040. So it's not something that is just a minority of people that you don't really need to worry about, or you can recruit your way around. These are people in the mainstream of the workforce. And also within that, we know that 25 to 30% of people have more than one health condition. So comorbidity is something that we don't tend to take as much notice of as we should. And we know that, for example, the best predictor of early return to work after a period of chronic low back pain is job satisfaction. It's not whether or not you get physiotherapy or an ergonomic chair. It's the quality of leadership in your organisation and whether or not you like your job. So these things are really very complicated, and you can over-medicalise this, and it's really important not to. Last depressing slide: comorbidity and ageing. So as we age, we have an elevated risk of developing more and more disorders as we go along. Now, some of these are going to be work limiting and some of them aren't. But you can see that one of the downsides of our success in having more and more older workers in the workforce is that we end up with more people with chronic health conditions. So the practical implication of that for employers is that they're going to need to get a lot better at prevention, risk assessment, job retention, workplace adjustments and job redesign, vocational rehabilitation, managing return to work. These are sort of core disciplines of occupational medicine, and those of you in larger organisations who have occupational health people, you're going to need more of them to do this, and you're going to need more managers who are aware of and skilled up in the processes of managing the consequences of having a diverse workforce of people who are living with and usually managing very well chronic health conditions that may have an effect on productive capacity. Let's look at this productivity question in a little bit more detail. As Cary said, we're using productivity, a range of productivity measures. I'm really talking mostly about labour productivity. So technically, that's the amount of output per hour worked, and that's how the Office of National Statistics measure this. And as Cary correctly said, the UK's performance on labour productivity is pretty poor compared with most of our competitors. And it was only really just as the pandemic hit that the UK productivity was hitting the same levels as it was prior to the global financial crash. So it had recovered very slowly, and then of course it's taken another hit. And of course, we've heard from the Prime Minister that he has an aspiration to have a high wage, high skill, high productivity economy. It's still very unclear what that really means and how you get to it. Because the traditional levers that we've been pulling to drive productivity, as I mentioned earlier, investment in skills and investment in technology, have been actually at relatively low levels of investment in both of those for the last 10, 15 years or so, which is sort of why we're arguing that the health of the workforce needs to be looked at in that mix as well. Part of the problem is that, as Cary said, in the service sector economy, few employers measure productivity in a very accurate or reliable or consistent way. Do you put your hand up if you measure productivity in a way that you trust? No. So if you're making cars, or you're making Marmite, or then it's relatively easy to measure the inputs to that as well as the outputs. But actually measuring output per hour worked in a law firm or an investment bank or even in a supermarket is actually quite hard. And one of the real conundrums here is that actually in many sectors of the economy, most organisations aren't really interested in productivity because it's very intangible to them. They're interested in profitability. And what you could argue, and there's some interesting case studies looking at this, that actually the drive for increased profitability can crowd out any efforts to improve productivity. And you can become more profitable by completely ignoring productivity. So it's rational in many sectors for employers to go for relatively inexpensive workers rather than investing in lots of technology to drive up productivity. Because keeping your labour costs low, and particularly if you've got a plentiful supply of workers, which we currently don't have, is a better way of driving short-term success than investing in productivity, which is a bit less tangible. So it is one of the big conundrums of our time, particularly in some sectors, that we seem to be stuck in a low-skill, low-pay equilibrium, which means that productivity is something we don't really bother about too much. And that is a real concern if, as we're beginning to see now, that both real wages and productivity have remained pretty stagnant over the last 10, 15 years or so, particularly the last 10 years. And that is a concern if we're really interested in improving living standards and if we want people to thrive. And we don't want people to have problems with financial well-being. And of course, if you overlay that with the issue of higher inflation, then that can be a challenge too. So the whole issue of productivity, the nature of work, well-being at work, what employers do to maximise performance, whether that's productivity or profitability, is really quite important for us to take a bit more notice of. And there's a big question about whether or not that's the job of government to do anything about, to what extent we should look at this at sectoral level. The conventional wisdom was that the UK was poor because it had a very long tail of poor performing companies. John Van Reenen and Nick Bloom of the LSE have been doing a lot of work on this, and they produced a report, the Centre for Economic Performance, as well as the Resolution Foundation, I think early last week, that said that it's not about tackling that long tail of poorly productive companies, it's just investing more in the ones that are doing well already. And that's a sort of quite Darwinistic approach, because what that says is that there's lots of small organisations who are never going to be highly productive, and we should just kill them off or let them die. Which is a very interesting way of thinking about industrial strategy. And that's something I think that we're yet to really grapple with. And of course, the pandemic has shone a light on this, perhaps in a way that hasn't been done since the financial crash. And I'm very interested to see to what extent the government has a position on this, and whether or not sector bodies like engineering and retail and others actually are taking a more strategic view about this. The other thing that's part of this whole debate is the commentary around precarious work. What you tend to find after an economic shock is as the labour market recovers, more organisations are dipping their toe back into the recruitment market, and they're recruiting people on temporary contracts or more precarious working arrangements because they're not completely certain that the demand is there to justify having people on a full-time or permanent basis. And so there's been this build-up of rhetoric about the UK labour market being characterised mainly by precarity, by people working in highly vulnerable working arrangements, and that's essentially the future. And the future of work in the UK is Deliveroo. And I think it's worth just having a little bit of a think about whether or not that's really true, just by looking at some of the data. So I apologise, I've got a couple of charts here. I don't expect you to look in the detail of them, but the key point is here, I've got just some different dimensions of the UK labour market going back to 1996 and then 2016. And I can update you on where we are now on each of these things, because I just want to challenge this notion that a UK labour market is essentially incredibly fragmented and characterised by job insecurity and precariousness. So just look quickly here, the share of jobs that are permanent is nearly 80%, and it always has been. Back to 2016, that's what it was like. It's still like it now. So we need to really think whether or not the commentary around precarious and flexible work is true. Share of people in full-time work has dropped a tiny bit, but remains broadly the same. Share of people working part-time has actually gone up a little bit. Share of people in self-employment, although it's taken a dip during the last 18 months, it's been climbing a little bit and is relatively stable at 13–14%. Share of temporary jobs, that's actually gone up a little bit in the most recent data, but it's never been above 10%, which might surprise some of you. Share of people in other employment, so that's people on the work schemes and so on, that fluctuates a little bit with unemployment. Share of people with a second job, very topical at the moment, I understand, is currently still about 3.5% of the workforce have a second job. It was much higher in 1996. And the proportion of people on 0 hours contracts, we didn't really know about that in 96, but it was 2.9% in 2016, hasn't gone up very much. There was a recent report by the TUC that suggested it had gone up massively, but actually on careful scrutiny of that report, it hasn't really changed very much at all. And the total proportion of people in the so-called gig economy, if you put all those different types of working arrangements together, is still only about 4%. So I guess the key message is that actually, despite all the shocks we see in the economy and fluctuations in labour demand, labour supply and so on, actually, broadly, the economy goes back to some sort of equilibrium point where we have 80% of people in permanent jobs, about a quarter of people in part-time work, less than 10% in temporary work. And whilst there's fluctuations there, actually we come back to a situation of some sort of equilibrium. And my guess is that that's going to happen this time. We've been hearing a lot just in the last couple of days about the Great Resignation, for example, that yes, actually, when you look at the data about just between July and September this year, 2.2 million people got new jobs or started new jobs, which sounds like a massive amount of churn. Half of those people were people coming off unemployment and into work. and half of those were people who just switched jobs. But actually, when you compare that against the trends over the last 20 years, it is high, but it's still about as high as it was in September 2007. So it's not unprecedented. I think there's an argument that it's happening a little bit more in the United States at the moment. And most of the frenzy about the Great Resignation are based on surveys done by Microsoft and by McKinsey that predict the number of people who say they're going to quit, which is about 40%. Having done loads of studies on whether or not people's stated intention to quit actually results in quitting, I'd say not worry, don't worry too much. And here's one of my favourite graphs, which is showing how long people stay in their jobs. This is data between 1994 and 2014. What it shows is a remarkable amount of stability. And interestingly, the average employment relationship lasted 8.2 years in 2014, compared with 7.9 years in 1994. So average job tenure has gone up over the last 20 or 30 years. People are more stable in their jobs. The idea that everyone's sort of moving around, having portfolio careers and jumping ship as soon as they can, is not borne out by the data. It's clear that in some organisations there is high churn at the bottom end, with people relatively short service and younger people, but in aggregate, there's a huge amount of stability in the labour market, again, despite the shocks. So what this tells us, I suppose, is the labour market is cyclical. All these things, labour flows and so on, are linked to the buoyancy of the labour market. And we should probably accept high churn and periods of high voluntary resignation as part of the landscape, but we shouldn't panic too much. And I just think we need to have a bit more faith in the UK labour market's ability to remain stable or revert back to some of its core characteristics. And I'm not panicking really that the pandemic is going to represent a change that is unprecedented. So lots of stability. I think there's obviously debates about whether or not hybrid working is happening. We know from certainly our work after lockdown studies that between 70 and 80% of people want to work 2 or 3 days at home. And for the most part, they, with their employers, are coming to very grown-up conclusions about how they should organise that. And it's certainly not, at least in my view, something the government needs to have an opinion on, other than for its own employees. We're seeing a growth of ideals, which is essentially a way of having individualised, flexible working arrangements. So rather than saying, we offer a job sharing scheme or we offer compressed hours working, there's much more chat now in organisations about having much more individualised deals. Now that potentially is a nightmare for HR people because of equality and fairness and precedent and so on, but it is something that's happening much more. Precarious work we talked about. We know there've been shortages in some key sectors, agriculture, hospitality, haulage. I'm old enough to remember when workforce planning was a thing. And we used to do it. We used to look at what different business scenarios, economic scenarios might hit us and look at our supply of labour, our demand for labour, our internal flows and so on. It was a relatively simple mathematical thing to do with a bit of business now thrown in at the top. I just wonder where workforce planning has gone. We're seeing big problems in the NHS because workforce planning is not something that seems to be done very systematically. So I think that's perhaps a skill that we need to rediscover. One thing that definitely has been exacerbated by the pandemic is burnout and moral injury. We're seeing many more examples of people experiencing burnout, which is not really a depressive illness. Burnout is about cynicism, it's about physical and mental exhaustion, it's about fatigue that is not relieved by sleep. And certainly we're seeing many more examples of occupational groups suffering from burnout. I've just finished a small piece of work looking at burnout amongst general practitioners. And moral injury is something that's been happening again a lot in the NHS, where as a nurse or a doctor, you've not been able, for example, to allow a family to come and visit a patient during their last hours. And that goes fundamentally against their training. And that's caused a lot of them to have PTSD and related mental health problems. And that's something we need to watch out for. I've talked a bit about Great Resignation, so I won't dwell too much on that again. I'm just conscious of the time. Technology next. So, as I said, technology is often identified as a disruptive force, a driver of productivity that's historically accompanied changes in the nature of work and how it's done. And usually with a bit of trepidation. There's, the robots are going to take our job narrative comes back occasionally to hit us. I think it was John Maynard Keynes, one of his lesser known predictions was that we'd all be working 15 hours a week because technology would enable us to liberate us to work and have very high, lots of leisure time and so on. He was wrong about that, obviously. I think that the technology debate can get overtaken by the geeks who are really, of course, interested in what's in the vanguard of technological development. And of course, that's really sexy and it's interesting and so on. But actually, in the mainstream, doesn't really have as much impact in the short term on the way that real people work as everyone would like to believe. And of course, the technology can affect productivity in really mundane ways. I remember speaking with Peter Salisbury, who was managing director of Marks and Spencer's a few years ago, and he said that for their business, the biggest step change in productivity in retailing was the adoption of the shopping trolley, or Boris Johnson, basically, as Dominic Cummings calls him. Actually, it reminds me of my only non-executive director joke. Which I will tell now because you mentioned them. What's the difference between a non-executive director and a shopping trolley? Both have equal capacity for food and drink, but only one has a mind of its own. That's all right. I'm here all week. Luckily not. So here's a few salutary quotations about technology. Actually, the first quote is at the top is Kevin Keegan. That's not about technology, but it is quite a good quote nonetheless. So Nobel Prize winner in 1903, the more important fundamental laws and facts of physical science have all been discovered. And these are so firmly established that the possibility of their being supplanted in consequence of new discoveries is extremely remote. That didn't really stand the test of time. Next one is about the telephone. Has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. The device is inherently of no value to us. Western Union, whatever happened to them? Rail travel at high speed is not possible because passengers unable to breathe would die of asphyxia. This is my favourite. The chairman of IBM in 1943 said, "I think there's a world market for maybe 5 computers." Well, they were the days when a mainframe filled a gymnasium. With about the same processing power as my spectacles. And then some sensible reflection at last. The president of the Institute for the Future said, and I think this is true, that we do tend to overestimate the effect of a technology in the short run and underestimate its effect in the long run. And I think that's just worth reflecting on in terms of some of the more excitable commentary around technology and its impact on the world of work. And of course, we see dystopian images of robots and so on, and all that is happening, and it's a great technology. And the challenge is, I suppose, is our ability to harness it and to diffuse it within our organisations in a way that is not so disruptive that it frightens the horses, but also we know from looking back over the last 40 or 50 years of technology in the workplace that unless you're putting as much investment into the human capital dimension, then the technology, no matter how sexy and wonderful it is not going to take hold. And that's something that I sometimes think we failed to learn. So as I say, the journalistic commentary and hyperbole tends to dominate the debate in this area. I think the balance of opinion now amongst futurologists is that technology is like to create more jobs than it destroys. And I think we need to bear that in mind as well. And I think technology has a massive capacity to enrich some jobs, particularly if it can remove some of the routine and repeatable tasks in those jobs. And that's not just about manufacturing, it is about some white collar jobs as well. And we need to think about that. And that's about ingenuity in the way we design and embrace these technologies and the way that we embed them into the way we work. It's not the fault of technology usually, it doesn't work in organisations. It's our fault, it's organisational culture It's you know, our expectations of it and the way that we manage to integrate it with other ways that we do our work. I think there are some examples of technology that are so sexy that they're provider led. You know, they're being pushed into organisations before organisations are ready to embrace them. I've just finished a short paper looking at the use of apps, particularly those that track our mental health and our mood. And they're taking off massively. There are thousands of them out there. Most of the time when you look at what they offer, they don't really stand up to very much scrutiny. Almost none of them have got an evidence base underpinning them at all. And actually, you know, most of them are downloaded fewer than 5,000 times each. Even though there's a whole bunch of providers pushing out mental health apps. Almost none of them, fewer than 10%, use the lived experience of people living with a mental illness in order to design them. So they're just pumped out there, usually by insurance companies, actually at the moment. So I think, you know, there's some lessons about how we embrace and diffuse technology through our organisations that we need to learn. And therefore, I think, you know, it's back to this point about technology failing to deliver in too many circumstances because it's scuppered by poor implementation and cultural barriers. So finally, the COVID accelerator effect. I think that we are seeing some significant and possibly permanent changes. I think the working from home experiment is one that we're still looking at and learning from. I think organisations are still trying to make sense of it all. But, you know, we all know managers who said even 5 years ago, flexible working won't work in that job. It's not possible. We can't possibly offer job sharing or you know, working at home for these people because you need to be in the office or you need to be in the workplace. And that's really been turned on its head. Because what it's meant is that organisations, and particularly line managers, as Cary was saying, need to really get to know how to manage virtual teams, flexible working, people not being in front of you the whole time, and how you manage people in that way, how you manage their needs as individuals for feedback, for example. We found in our work after lockdown study, for example, that introverts have been doing a lot worse working at home than extroverts, which is at one level counterintuitive. But actually, you know, if you're on Zoom or Teams calls the whole day, that's actually completely emotionally exhausting for introverts. They get almost no time to recuperate and replenish their resources. So we need to think about, you know, how different types of employee deal with the working at home challenge. We know there's lots of evidence that younger workers have struggled a bit more with their mental health working remotely, partly because, you know, living in a shared house or with mum and dad has been a bit more difficult, but also they just do miss the social connectivity of work much more than some of their older colleagues, and of course we all miss that to an extent as well. Also, I think working from home has become a bit politicised, which is unfortunate. You know, Cary mentioned Chief Executive Goldman Sachs, who called working from home an aberration, which we will correct, I think was the rest of his quote. So we may see how that will work. Also, Sir James Dyson was very cross about working from home. He called people who work from home cocooned and people who work in the office diligent, until it emerged that when he was on Desert Island Discs a few years ago, he was boasting about how when he first developed his overly expensive plastic Hoover, that he did all that work at home, which he didn't like to have that pointed out, unfortunately. Now, it does seem to me that most organisations, as I say, are taking a very sort of grown-up approach to doing this and feeling their way, and it's something that I think they need to be left to do. And I think there's some experiments going on. I think there's a recognition that you know, people need more collaborative space, so it's having an effect on the design of workspaces, which I think is all very sensible. And I suppose the other thing that it's doing is getting people to think about whether or not some certain types of work are more time dependent or location dependent than others. Here's a very oversimplified 4-quadrant model looking at this, but you know, thinking about what types of work need to be done in a particular location, or which don't have to be in a location at all, and those that need to be done at a certain time or are time independent, is a useful way of thinking about it. So you'd put in the right hand quadrant an author, for example, and the left hand quadrant, perhaps a hairdresser. But I think what's happening in real organisations is that there's a lot more subtlety than this going on. There's sort of job cataloguing exercises going on. So organisations are thinking not just about what jobs need to be located in an office or in a physical location, but what types of tasks need to be performed physically and collaboratively with other people, and which can be done at home. I think most organisations are doing that sort of analysis at the moment. And you can't probably get the whole workforce of an organisation in one of those quadrants. So thinking about it at role level and at task level is the way to go. And I think that we're seeing a lot more intelligent thinking about that and collaborative ways of edging their way through to new ways of working that are acceptable and giving employees a voice in that whole process. And I think it's an entirely sensible thing to do. Whether or not it all goes back to where we were only 2 years ago remains to be seen, but I think somehow the genie is out of the bottle, and we're going to see some permanent shifts. This is pretty much my last slide, which I could talk about for about an hour, which I won't. But the shifting agenda for HR professionals, I think, is therefore one of the things that we need to grapple with, and this is where we need more evidence and more research and more good case studies of good practice. But how does this new reality affect some conventional, relatively workaday HR processes like performance management, reward, succession planning, recruitment, induction? All those sort of things have actually been transformed a little bit. I've got someone in my organisation who I've never met physically who's left. So I've had to manage both their induction and their exit interview without actually physically meeting them. It's just weird. Ideals, I talked about individual flexible working deals. What is happening to collective bargaining in that context? What are the role of trade unions? Are trade unions being proactive in this area? Are they embracing the new reality, or are they fighting against it? I think probably both are represented amongst the range of trade union views about this, but I think the trade union movement has gone a bit quiet on this, and I'd like to hear a bit more from them. Revisiting our models of motivation and engagement. So, as Cary said, there's a strong relationship between control, autonomy, discretion in a job and people's productivity and their well-being. And there's a golden triangle there that we're not very good at articulating or exploiting or building upon. Trust, leadership, line management capability is absolutely critical. Chapter 4 in the book says, ask the question, is your manager bad for your health? And actually in the last section of that chapter, the subheading is, random acts of kindness are allowed. And that's true. And we need to get line managers to embrace that principle. Being a nice person and being empathetic is not a sign of weakness as a line manager. Too many of them think it is. We spoke to a manager in a big organisation at the beginning of the pandemic who said, I firmly believe that stress at work is a better driver of productivity than well-being. And that informed his thinking about well-being at work. Now, you could argue that's, postmodern, or it's a Neanderthal view. Do we value outputs more than inputs now? We're thinking more about what we value about what people perform, how they perform, and how we measure it. What have we learned about the dramatic pivoting that many organisations have had to do in terms of their agility and resilience? From making gin to making hand gel. It's proved to themselves that they've managed to transform really quickly, and therefore some of the objections to transforming quickly they've always used in the past have perhaps disappeared, and they've proven to themselves they can turn on a sixpence. Social capital, knowledge-based organisations, that's linked to the social connectivity that people thrive, and the fact that in knowledge-based organisations, knowledge exchange and social capital are forms of competitive advantage that you need to exploit. Involvement and participation in decision making, people are expecting that now, perhaps more than ever before. And then there's a bigger question about HR's role as the sort of moral compass of business. 51% of line managers say in the last year they've been asked to do something they feel ethically uncertain with. And I think there's a question there about whether the HR function is doing as much as it could to play a more ethical stewardship role over all this. So I think the last 2 years have provided some rich opportunities for learning and reflection, and I think we need to think about which of those we need to capture most urgently. And then there's another question about whether we can embrace and benefit from the opportunities that future offers if we fail to upgrade the UK's management capability. And that for me is the biggest impediment to productivity management. And that's just, has always been the case, and it always will be. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So we're just going to take a quick 15-minute break, so we can come back at about 10 to. Cary and Stephen will take questions, as I said, during the panel session. The last of Stephen's discussion questions on there actually is part of the discussion around leadership and leadership capability, which we want to cover in the panel session primarily. So any questions for Stephen or Cary on that topic specifically, let's bring them back when we come back. So we'll have 15 minutes, then Joel will talk us through how very practically Microsoft are dealing with the scarcity of talent for their organisation, and then we'll go into the panel session. So thank you all. Thank you, Cary. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much.
I hope everyone's feeling refreshed after some lovely coffee and cake put on by the guys at Armstrong Craven. I'm going to try and follow suit as best as I can with the second half of today's session by the great guys of this morning. Today, I'm going to be discussing a topic that has been close to all of us in the way of hiring over the past 24 months, and just how challenging that's been. So as we look to challenge the norm and digital innovation, I used an analogy to somebody earlier on today around the Blockbuster. Blockbuster was a wonderful, wonderful experience for all of us. That Friday evenings, turning up, using the experiences of tasting the popcorn, looking at the movies, selecting them and taking them home, and no doubtedly probably bring them back late on a Monday morning, right? I think obviously as we look at digital innovation and the digital innovation in that sense, we see the new Netflixes and obviously Disney Pluses of the world superseding the Blockbuster of old. It is no different when we look to hire. And over this past 24 months, it's been really, really challenging in the way that we speak with talent, we engage with them, and we onboard them. When the pandemic really, really struck and there was a lockdown in the UK, I think around March, April time, Microsoft went on a short freeze, and there was a little bit of uncertainty as to our next move in the market. For me, as a talent sourcer, it was one of the one times that I was really able to put my feet up. But within about a month, I was told, Joel, we need to start hiring again. And 18 months later, we managed to hire 24,000 individuals across Microsoft globally, but by no mean feat. Come as you are, do what you love. It was one of the very first phrases that I heard upon joining Microsoft. The Microsoft of old, almost your father's Microsoft, has changed drastically over the past 10, 15, 20 years. Come as you are, do what you love is a really, really powerful term. It's something that's stuck with me for many, many years, over the 6.5 years, in fact, since I joined. And gives me the belief that I'm able to do the best of my work on a daily basis by working with some of the very best and smartest minds on a daily basis. And also with that, it gives me that safe haven that I'm not working for an employer that is going to drive me into the ground. I have that safe space knowing that I'm able to perform to the best of my ability. As we're talking about empowering each and every employee here at Microsoft, we talk about trust, entrepreneurship, and customer-obsessed behavior. If we couple both trust and entrepreneurship together, very much they go hand in hand. We're given the trust and the belief that in order to do the best of our work, we do it in our own time and manage our own diaries as we see fit. We've done a lot of competency-based skills hiring over the past 24 months, and that has very much been our shift. And again, one of the speakers earlier on today touched on that notion. We simply do not know what is going to be next in line in the way of tech. Years and years ago, we talked about quantum computing, we talked about artificial intelligence, and today they're pretty much a thing. So in order to hire for competency-based skills, we're hiring for adaptability, for change, and individuals that are going to be able to grow with the business in time. How we've managed to hire 24,000 people without being present in person and being there on their very first day, Microsoft Teams. I'm not here to sell Microsoft Teams naturally. But front and center of my screen every single day is Microsoft Teams. I know there's obviously the discussion around techno stress and then negativity towards that, but it has so many positives coming out of it as well. The collaboration, the instantaneousness, the collaboration, the instantaneousness and the simultaneousness in order to work on the same app at exactly the same time as your colleague is fundamental in a lot of our success, especially when we're assessing for 24,000 candidates and more. We need to give that feedback to every single candidate within a 48-hour time frame, or we may miss the boat and they could go to a competitor. I actually don't know who said this quote. For me, and as I depict this quote, strategy gets you from point A to point B. With culture, for me, it gets you from point A to point B and beyond. Culture is our biggest strength here at Microsoft. And as I've been with Microsoft for more and more years, I feel less of the need to tell people in the market as to who we are as a business and what we're looking to achieve. It's them coming to me and saying, Joel, I want to work for Microsoft. I've got a friend that works for Microsoft, and these are my reasons. It's our biggest strength when we look to hire. And again, above monetary figures, above, hybrid working, culture is our biggest strength, as well as retaining talent here at Microsoft, as our competitors look to take them on board as well. As we talk about culture, it's instilled in every single employee within Microsoft. We have a visionary as a leader, we have an innovator, and we all believe in that vision, and we muck in as one in order to achieve the one Microsoft feel and the one Microsoft goal. Diversity, inclusion, and mindset. Of course, we can talk about teams that are hugely successful, and by bringing on diverse minds, it gives it a different feel, a different experience, a different mindset. But as we look to the market and of course the customers that we wish to serve on a daily basis, we need to have that diversity of thought in order to ship those products to market that are going to serve our customers as well. Here at Microsoft, we talk about a family culture. The first time that I walked through those doors on my very, very first day, I still get that same buzz to the present day. I felt welcomed, I felt supported. And when we talk about support, I don't mean just inside the workplace and achieving my goals and working to project deadlines. I'm a family man, and I'm sure a lot of you have families of your own. It's been strenuous over the past 24 months. And front and center, my manager has always brought up the topic of how are things? It's a simple term, but how are things? Can I help you? Can I support you? Do you need time off? And again, that support makes me want to do more at Microsoft. We talk about a culture of learn-it-alls at Microsoft, not know-it-alls. I think by bringing on board a know-it-all, what can we potentially give them, right? If they know everything, what can they give to Microsoft? What can we give them? But again, talking about competency and skills-based interviewing and bringing on people that want to adapt and change and grow their careers at Microsoft, we want to see that. We want to experience that. And by hiring learn-it-alls, we're also talking about the ability to fail. Because by learning from those experiences, we hope that next time round that they're able to be hugely successful once again. Onboarding. We've talked about the Great Resignation in the previous session. Onboarding, as we all know, is a hugely strenuous time for each and every department, particularly HR, wondering whether the person is going to show up on their first day or not. And the role of the direct line manager has been doubled down in the past 24 months here at Microsoft. It's gone from an inclusion of 10% of that onboarding to around 20% now. And a lot of the time, management here at Microsoft are going outside of their own duties to speak with the candidate, email the candidate, and make sure that they have all of the resources available in readiness for their start. It's a collaborative approach when we look to onboard. It's not just HR, it's not just finance, it's everyone across the board, inclusive of IT, as we work in a hybrid world, shipping that laptop to the person's front door and make sure that it's set up for their very, very first day. As we talk about continuous development and onboarding, we talk about the buddy scheme, because within that first 6 months, it's hugely detrimental to that person's perspective of the company. So we need to make sure that once more they're supported and they're welcomed here at Microsoft. And by providing each and every new starter here at Microsoft, they have a buddy ready to support them in their growth, development, and of course, any questions that they feel uncomfortable with asking maybe their manager. Again, once more, they are supported in that sense. As we look to training and career paths, HR is a wonderful, wonderful career path, but we know that within Microsoft, there are so many areas that individuals can move into. So that individual will have that one-to-one time with their manager, not only about their current workload and how they're feeling at work, but also where they want to go into in future career paths at Microsoft, whether that is into solutions architecture or whether that's into finance or elsewhere. Again, the skilling is almost infinite here at Microsoft, and there's so many resources, and sometimes it could be hard to navigate. So it's up to that person's line manager to help guide them with all of that. As we move on to the day-to-day hybrid workforce, why, when, how? There's been a lot of businesses over the past 24 months that have told employees, we're expecting you back in the office. And again, they face a lot of cultural resistance in that manner, and hence the Great Resignation. With Microsoft, there is no stipulation between you need to be in the office on this day, or we need you to be present at this time, or expecting you to be present at this meeting at such and such time. We manage our diaries as we see fit. And one of the big SLAs that my team and I have agreed is that no emails go out after noon on a Friday, and with that, no meetings as well. Because again, we do not want that person to have that stress going into the weekend, that they face challenges or deadlines going into the Mondays or Tuesday of the following week. We talk about wellness and well-being a lot. Again, this is a huge topic of discussion here at Microsoft and for many organizations. And Microsoft have given back tremendously in this sense. Some people have families, some people have dogs, some people have outside interests. And of course, we know that, and we want to give back. We have been given so much caregiving leave over this period that should we have elderly parents or people who are maybe ill, we're able to care for them without feeling guilty that we're not doing our day work. In the way of additional educational supplements and also celebrity speakers here at Microsoft, Microsoft don't have to do this, but morale at times it can be low. And again, investing in our staff and supporting our staff is a huge belief. We have had the likes of Joe Wicks exercising with us. We've had Nadia Hussein cooking with us. And we've had Sophia Ellis-Bextor also dancing with us. And it's by putting those events on for us as employees, we firmly feel invested in and obviously wanting to do the best of our work at Microsoft once more.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
If I could just ask Emma and Cary and Stephen just to join me. I shall we'll take that down if I can manage it. Good, just about. So grab a seat. So if we just do the last hour, we're just going to have a panel session. So we're going to do, I've got a few questions. Do you want to grab a seat, Joel? We're going to have a few questions and then we'll do some questions, either Q&A from the live stream,
yeah,
and or questions from the room. Okay, so Emma, can I just let you do an introduction first, because everyone else has had an opportunity to and you haven't yet.
I love to talk as well as Kane.
Oh, that's good.
I'm Emma Blaney, so I'm the HR and CSR Director for Euromonitor International, which is the world's leading private market research company. So 1,500 full-time staff based across 15 offices globally. So COVID has been fantastically fun for the HR department for us, and also another 2,000 contractors based in around 200 countries.
Good. I'm going to try and keep still just in case it's me that's crackling. I'm not sure who it is, one of us. So the topic, the broad topic we wanted to have for this panel session, excuse you guys behind us, I just realised you're behind. We've talked about it through a number of the sessions today. There's been a huge change in leadership styles and leadership requirements over the last 18 months. So what we just wanted to talk about was how the world of work in terms of leadership has changed over that 18 months. The skills that are required, what changes organisations have had to make when considering the new social and moral responsibilities, which again seem to have come to the fore as we discussed earlier. So what impact is ESG having? Are we recruiting for skills or experience in leadership? So just that broader conversation around leadership, and managing remotely is probably the first place to start. And Emma, given that you are the HRD amongst the group, how have you found that in your organisation?
In terms of the managing remote piece, it was very obvious very early on that some managers were finding this really, really difficult. It's a difficult concept as well, because it's very different moving into an environment where suddenly you feel as though you've lost control at a time when you're also needing to be significantly more sympathetic to people's individual circumstances than you would normally need to be. Yeah. So in terms of the approach which we took, we actually invested very heavily in external training on hybrid management itself, just to try to give our managers the tools to enable them to understand a little bit better, and also giving them the ability to make more decisions themselves. So really kind of empowering them to make decisions which were right for their team. You know, when you're working in a very matrix environment across 15 different countries, actually what was right for our Shanghai office was exceptionally different to what was correct in Sydney or Singapore at the same time. And many of our managers are managing across all of those jurisdictions together. Yeah. So they were trying to really kind of have a single approach as they normally would in management style. So we had to train them in understanding. It had to be very individual, very unique, very sympathetic to individual need. And I think, you know, kind of building in that kind of investing in that training for all 250 managers globally was fundamental in at least starting those conversations with them. Something that's interesting is when I saw your 4 kind of point grid, Stephen, we actually used something very similar. We're really trying to push to those managers. Let's really try and unpick each of the roles, all the responsibilities, and work out which are critical, which aren't critical, and which can be worked in different styles and in different ways. So
and was that brand new training? So that's literally brand new to that cohort of managers? Absolutely,
yeah, absolutely brand new training. We've always kind of considered ourselves to be exceptionally flexible, but that flexibility has been very much around the hours we enable people to work. Yeah. It hasn't been about remote working. And it was something that none of them had ever been through before. So it was new to every single manager.
And Stephen, has any of your research touched on that around leadership development?
Yeah, I mean, the surveys that we've been doing of people working from home since the beginning of the lockdown, the quality of management's come out as being a really critical feature in affecting important outcomes for individuals. So, for example, those employees who score well on we use the WHO 5 measure of mental well-being in our surveys. The people who scored best on that also reported they had more frequent contact with their manager. That their manager seemed to be understanding their needs and was being more empathetic and flexible and all the things that Cary was talking about. And also, there was a really strong correlation between people who were scoring high on that and people with higher productivity. So you can almost see a direct line of sight between quality of management, mental well-being and productivity. And I thought that was, you know, perhaps you'd expect to see that, but it was good that it was being reinforced. I think the other thing that we also found was that those managers who said that they had received extra support and training from their employer about how to manage remote teams also felt more confident in the way that they were doing that. So there was a clear, again, line of sight between that investment and producing better outcomes. That's not to say they didn't find it challenging. And I think, you know, Cary's caricature earlier about, you know, we only get people into line management jobs because they're good engineers or accountants. I think that still is a problem. But I think there's a recognition amongst managers now, having been through this experience, that you can't do remote management and effective line management without having a high degree of empathy and flexibility, cognitive flexibility, in understanding that a command and control approach is not going to work. You know, we know over many years of research that the best approach to managing in a high performance organisation is secure resources for your people, make sure they're clear about what's expected of them, and then really back off and trust them to get on with things. And that's been amplified in the way that good organisations have managed people remotely.
And Cary, in terms of your work, have you seen, you probably talk to more leaders than any of us, have you seen leaders looking for different things out of their senior team?
Well, during the pandemic, there's something interesting happened. I was involved with a global company doing a survey across a number of countries. And one thing we found, we were looking at intention to leave and during the pandemic and what were people experiencing about the pandemic. And the people, it was a high proportion of people, not who were going to leave, but were thinking about leaving. Yeah. And when they were thinking about leaving during the pandemic or subsequent to, when they get back to the workplace fully and everything else, the key factor was how they were managed during it. That was the key predictor of it. And bad management, and like we talked about earlier, the more empathetic and so on, the more the line manager during the pandemic called people up and did one-to-ones with them and nothing to do with work. So they had their team meetings. The ones that seemed to do the best job and that had less of an intention to leave were those that would call up Fred and say, Fred, I know, how are you feeling? Because they noticed in the meeting that they had, even though it was virtual, that Fred, who normally is involved, extrovert, was very withdrawn. See, that's what empathy and emotional intelligence is all about. And those people who had it would call up Fred and say a day later, so, how you doing, Fred? Did you watch a football game? I mean, not Fred, I noticed you were, looking depressed, but using their skills to get Fred to talk about what was going on. And I think that highlighted for me this global, by the way, it wasn't just in the UK, this was a global survey. Yeah. And so it highlighted for me the real significance of the issue of leadership. And for recruitment places like you guys and all recruiters in the future, and people in HR who are internally promoting people to management jobs, really have to take this into account in the future, because if the hybrid model is here to stay, which I think it is, then how are you going to manage remote teams? How are you going to know they have manageable workloads? Really, how do you know they're not, don't have problems? Yeah. Mental health is a big problem. So for me, that's going to be the big issue.
Yeah.
Go on, no, Emma, go.
So it's quite interesting leading fibers. An error which we definitely made was we absolutely were very clear with our managers straight away the importance of having lots of one-to-ones, spending a little bit of time saying, how are you, all of those things. And that worked exceptionally well. And all of our employees towards the lower end of our hierarchy felt exceptionally well supported. The error we made is we forgot the pressure that was putting on our managers.
Yeah.
And at month 3, we suddenly had some line managers who were utterly exhausted because they were looking at their diaries and they were saying, all that I'm doing all day, every day is going from Teams call to Teams call, no matter how amazing Teams is. It was back to back
Teams, Joel,
Teams call.
We do like Teams.
And our error was we forgot the additional pressure which we were putting onto those middle managers, and they were utterly exhausted. So we actually had to quite quickly put in place things like Meeting Free Friday, which I hasten to add is probably one of the biggest benefits we have ever given our management teams. You are prohibited from any internal meetings on a Friday. It is amazing to wake up on Friday morning and plan your day.
I should maybe make a note of that. But sorry, team, is in the room.
Have a meeting about it.
Maybe tomorrow.
A Teams meeting, a Zoom them out more.
But it was really hard. And
this is a very important point. The point we concentrated on the people, the direct reports, and we didn't. I don't think HR or anybody concentrated on what's the manager feeling about having to go, because the encouragement was to do one-to-ones, wasn't it? The encouragement was, don't just have your team meeting, do one-to-ones, because make sure that they're okay. Okay, fine. And now some people found that really difficult to do, right? And they needed help. And they had so much of that on them, on top of doing their day job, and top of having the other meetings, on top of all of us being bloody zoomed out to death. And it would have been nice if we'd have concentrated a bit on the line manager to find out what he or she was thinking about.
And actually, in the book, there's a section called The Squeeze Middle, which talks exactly about the multiple pressures from different directions that managers face. I was involved in a study in an Australian bank where 37% of middle managers had undiagnosed depression. And they go under the radar because once you get to a certain point in the hierarchy, you're expected to be bulletproof and very resilient and able to cope with pretty much everything that's thrown at you. And actually, you don't admit you've got a problem, because there's still in some organisations a pervasive culture that says once you start admitting that you've got a problem, then you're seen as flaky or unreliable, and someone who can't be trusted to build, to have a bigger job.
And I do think as well, our senior managers are spending a lot of time with the middle managers asking how their teams were.
Yes,
They weren't actually saying how are you, they were saying how's your team. How many times have you connected with your team?
That's right.
And it's why that group of middle managers were certainly the ones which we suddenly realised we hadn't given the care and attention to, and everything was landing on them. They were the ones that were picking up the fact that, we said to people who had school-aged children when the schools were closed that they only had to work half the capacity, and they could choose when they were working. We only expected them to deliver half. What we forgot about was we didn't say the same to the managers of those teams. We kind of said, well, your team needs to deliver.
And what was Meeting Free Friday? I mean, presumably there are other interventions as well, were there?
Absolutely. So we have reduced our core hours to 11 till 3. So you only need to work between 11 and 3. You can space out all of your hours at any other time which is suitable for you. We have Meeting Free Fridays, which is just, don't underestimate how powerful Meeting Free Fridays. We have a policy where you can work from anywhere, because as some of our Asian offices started to open up, we found that lots of people hadn't been able to connect with family and friends. So we put in place a policy where people could work from overseas locations for a number of days a year, because we were finding that one of the reasons why employees in places such as Singapore were looking to leave is because of the restrictions of travel and wanting to go home. So we were thinking, well, instead of leaving, you can work there for an agreed amount of time and come back, just to try and retain good talent.
I think, Joel, some of those sound familiar. I think Microsoft had done some of those things around that middle management group and management support.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, touching on the notion of surveys and feedback, again, Microsoft, there's been so many surveys you wouldn't believe over the past 24 months.
Too many?
Possibly. Possibly, but no, I think it's obviously all for the good, because obviously we want to know how people are feeling, inclusive of middle managers at the end of the day, and that goes back up the food chain. And then obviously we make adjustments in the way that we train and bring new resources to those teams, and of course the tools that we use, and of course the hours where we're meeting, and so on and so forth.
And Stephen, coming back to you, I'm going to ask you the forward-looking question as the man who has the most statistics at his fingertips. If you're thinking about succession planning and aligning leadership skills to strategy going out into sort of 3 to 5 years, what do you see changing? Because we talked about some slightly different skill sets which have been necessary through the recession. Do you see those persisting?
I think so. I mean, I think it has shone a light on the need to have a people orientation, even if you are, a finance director or a marketeer. I mean, Cary and I have had lots of conversations over the years about, the content of MBA programs, for example. And essentially, I was on a call the other day when someone said to me, how many people who do MBAs are taught about well-being? And I said, well, to be honest, most of them aren't taught about human resource management or people management. It's seen as still as a relatively low priority discipline. It's all about financial management and marketing and all those good things, about how to analyze markets and so all that sort of stuff. So I think in the future, you really can't be a manager in an organisation without paying some attention to and attaching importance to, as an individual, those people management skills. And I think the other thing is that managers will have to have a better developed sense of is seeing patterns, identifying, joining the dots on things that are happening both externally in the labour market and in the workforce and in the wider economy, and what they're doing internally. At the moment, too many of the people I talk to in organisations are focused on what they're doing in their business only, and they're not really lifting their head above the horizon to do any horizon scanning and monitoring about what's going on. And I think actually you can't afford not to do that in a very rapidly changing world. And I think those two things are the things that I think that will need to be given more priority.
Cary?
Steve said something really interesting about.
Go on, at last.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. He said something.
Make
really...
a note of the time. What you got that, Amelia?
Well, I mean, I'm in a business school, one of the top business schools in the world. Guess what? Neither my business school nor do any of the other business schools in the UK or the US or anywhere, that 99% of them do cognitive input on their MBA students. They teach them about economics, HR, organization behavior, finance and accounting, right? All cognitive. Then this person who's now 28, so they're the average, say, MBA student, he does an undergraduate degree, then he or she goes and work for 6 or 7 years. Then they come back and they do an MBA, okay? And no matter what they did, if they did a management undergraduate degree even, and they come back, and if you were to put any of those in a group to manage a group of people, you'd be crazy. Because you know what we haven't done? We haven't made it personal. It's your behavior. And strangely enough, when I'm this old, that in the 1960s and 70s, when I came over to Britain at the end of the 60s, 70s, we had something called T-group training. You probably don't know it. Now, T-group training used to take groups of managers away for a week in a hotel, and they'd stay in a group, and they'd look at their own behavior with people who were effectively therapists to look at their behavior, because the view in the 70s and the 60s in business schools, funny enough, was that what you have to do is you have to manage human beings. Therefore, you have to know about yourself. We don't do that now. So everything is cognitive. Now, what the business schools will say, by the way, I brought business school deans together with Dame Carol Black in the Department of Work and Pensions to talk about this issue. Why aren't we developing them personally, develop their personal skills, find out how people actually perceive you in your role, right? And the business schools all admitted they don't do that. But you know what they'll say? Their response is, but that's what business does. They should be doing that. Well, business doesn't do it either. So where are you learning about yourself vis-a-vis other people? Somebody said at this table, I think somebody said that managers think they're good at what they do. Or somebody, maybe it was, I can't remember where it was. They think, oh, I'm a great people manager. And the woman said, he's absolutely crap. I mean, he's not good. And, but he thinks he is. Well, that's what you have to learn about yourself. Until we do this experiential training, and at business schools, by the way, but also in companies to develop people so they know more about themselves. That's how they develop empathy and social interpersonal skills. And we haven't done that enough. So leadership is also about learning about you. How do people really see me?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, two things. One is there's way too many of my team in this room for me to feel comfortable with you repeating
You're in
that.
Trouble, Peter.
Yeah, it would seem so. How do we then find the leaders of the future with the right skills? I mean, Emma, what's your Euromonitor doing?
In terms of the way that we're changing our approach pragmatically, actually, is we're now starting to recruit and promote against our values rather against anything else. So we're actually recruiting and promoting now against things like integrity, curiosity, how good you are at empowering other people to do things. Diversity is now one of our core values, and we're talking about diversity in terms of being open to the views of everybody and the widest view possible, because we understand that for functional skills, we can test functional skills, and that's pretty straightforward. But actually for more senior roles, for leadership roles, it's all about behaviour. And when you spoke about kind of the succession planning piece, we're not even trying to predict what roles we will have in the next 3 to 5 years, because we don't know. However, we know who we believe has the potential to progress because of their behaviours around our values, how they behave at work. And just, that kind of integrity piece is absolutely fundamental, because people will come with you if they are confident in you, they believe in you, they believe that you're actually being transparent and being honest with them. And those skills will come with you regardless of the roles the business needs of you, because they're much more inherent. So we're really changing a lot of our recruitment strategy to recruit really predominantly against the values of our business, because we know we can train people who have the right attitude and who are behaving in the way that we want them to behave. It's far more difficult to bring in a technical expert and convert them into your culture.
Values and behaviours recruitment rather than skills for leadership.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously minimum level skills for certain functional roles, but in the main, it's about behaviours and values.
And how new is that, Cary? Because you've probably seen this in lots of different places.
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking, it's something that happened to me a while ago, pre-COVID this happened. And, you know, looking at how do we get these skills, how do we know about, you know, you're talking about values and things like that, which I think are really important. And I remember once I was in an interview and the interview wasn't going well. It was a group interview with a particular candidate. Okay, so there were 3 of us interviewing this person. And it was kind of a dysfunctional interview. And I felt that all of a sudden I wasn't interviewing. I became my occupational psychologist. I became a psychologist because I was worried. And I thought to myself, I'm not learning about this person and there's a little bit of hostility toward him. And I then said something I never have done before. I said, the question I had to the candidate was, what do you think is going on right here, right now? I don't know what made me do that. Maybe it's from my old T group days. But I said, because I was unhappy about what was going on, actually. I felt somebody was getting at this particular person. And it was interesting because I found out more from that response, I think we all did, than anything. And this candidate was actually very good and said, well, I feel a lot of tension in you, in the 3 of you. It was interesting. And I thought, wow, maybe I should be doing this more. I've never done it again, by the way. But the point I'm trying to make is, how do I get at that? How do I get at this person's ability to see what's going on between people? And I think if the more sensitive they would be, the more I think it would be better, as long as they have the technical skills. They do have to have the technical skills.
But you can test technical skills so easily in many other ways.
Yeah, we have to do. We have to find values is very important because I think that's important. But you have.
I think what's happening. I mean, your point about mapping people against a sort of general set of values and attributes, because you can't predict what the job that they might be doing in 3 or 4 years' time might be, is absolutely the way to go. And actually, some of the smart organisations, multinationals, have been doing this. I did a lot of work a few years ago with BP, and they have a way of sort of mapping out people's potential career paths. You know, you probably can't be in a very senior management job unless you run a refinery in Malaysia or something, that sort of thing. But I think the idea that you can very precisely fit a person to the demands of a job that you don't really know whether it's going to exist or not is just sort of pie in the sky. So actually thinking about generic attributes that align with values is important. But I think the other thing is that being brave enough to say, we value this person because they're absolutely brilliant technically, so we should keep them the hell away from managing.
Exactly.
People. And we shouldn't penalise them in the grading system or the job evaluation system. We should have a way of attaching a value to their contribution, which means they don't have to be encumbered by managing people.
But Steve, to do that, if we have a pyramidal system like this, to get the status and more money, you have to climb the greasy pole. Right? It's like that. If we had it as a square, where people could go up the system, because you're a great classroom teacher, you might be an absolutely disaster as a head teacher, as a management role. But why can't we pay the teacher who's really good and find ways of determining that a high wage, almost that of a head teacher? Some of them. I'm just trying to rethink it, but if we have the pyramidal system, people will go for senior management jobs. Because it's higher status, it's more money, even if they're not competent to do it.
Do you see organisations that do that well?
I don't know any organisation that does it well, frankly.
No.
But I think the problem
Stephen?
is...
I think so, there are bits of the civil service that do it well. I think they realise that in some areas they do need technical experts, and they have parallel career paths, and those are reflected in the pay system and so on, and they don't have to take on board people.
You're right. I know one, a law firm. I had to do the judge of the Bar Association and the Law Society had the well-being. Companies would, legal firms and barrister firms would have to would put forward their well-being strategy. And I was one of the judges with a judge from the Law Society and the Bar Association. And all of them were doing things like we do mindfulness at lunch and all that kind of stuff. The typical, they were dead uninteresting. And we all thought that. But one firm said, they asked their employees what they wanted. And the employees said, well, we don't want the structure in a law firm. It's associate, partner, equity partner. It's real hierarchy. Anybody who works at a law firm knows that, right? And do you know what they did, this law firm? They listened to it. And what the employees said, all the lawyers, a big firm, said, we don't want fees, objectives for our fees, like we have to earn a certain amount of fee hours in.
Yeah.
We don't want the hierarchy. We don't want the associate, da, 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 da. We want to work and make more money. The longer we work, we make more money. The more hours we decide to put in. And if we want to be workaholics, fine. But if you don't want to, you don't do it. And guess what? They did it. And then they followed it through for the next, profound change. With one person at the top who helped administer the whole thing, but not a hierarchy. And I thought, God, this is so, it shocked us all to see it. But I'm not saying everybody should do that. But what I'm saying is that we're looking carefully at the way they develop their talent and use them in the most appropriate way. Because some lawyers didn't want to become an equity partner.
Yeah.
Because they had a family and they wanted to, you know what law is. Law is 70, 80 hours a week, 90 hours a week. So I thought that was quite interesting.
And Joel, in Microsoft, the functional experts in Microsoft, how does that work as a twin track versus line people managers?
Yeah, I'm not going to say that IT does it perfectly, but at the end of the day, I think Apple in the early 2000s, they started to coin the term evangelist, which, as you've alluded to, if you're very good at your job, the next step should be management or director, mindset-wise. But other organisations like your Apples, like your Googles, like your Microsoft, we started to coin the term evangelist, and in fact, they could be even seen as even more senior than their own manager, because they know that's they have that subject matter expertise and they know that topic inside out. So again, I feel like there's the potential for a lot more change within IT than maybe other organisations. I'm not too sure.
Yeah, and it also feels from some of the stuff we've worked with you guys on that you do hire very much for values over skills in a lot of cases.
Yeah, again, you could have the greatest solution architect on earth, but if they act as a lone wolf, they're not collaborative, you know, they don't believe in that culture and the values, you know, they're not really going to evolve and they're not really going to bring much to us and we're not going to bring much to them. So absolutely, if you believe in that culture and that vision, then we can teach you and hopefully you can teach us a lot of stuff as well.
Have we got any questions in the room? I think the last session we didn't quite leave enough time. We've got any questions? Any hands up? And I think, have you got the, yeah? Any questions? If not, we'll go back to me. Richard. Oh, sorry, behind. Did you have a question, Nick? Oh, no, just to it. Richard.
I'm a non-executive director, so I'm just wondering when the wine starts. I've kind of think I've worked in different organisations because I've seen success come through completely dysfunctional organisations. In fact, most of the organisations I've worked in are complete chaos. And it's sometimes the drive and the challenge and the conflict that comes through that kind of culture that takes a business to different places. And my worry is, and I know you're not saying this, but kind of making it too nice isn't actually always going to get you to the right place. Discuss.
I think it's easy to interpret what we've said as, you know, it being, you know, a Sunday school with lots of hugs and everyone being lovely to each other. I don't think those. I don't think those things are mutually exclusive at all. I mean, a few years ago, I was involved in a big study where we were looking at what are the factors that differentiate between high-performing organisations and the rest. And we did find that, you know, being hard-nosed, being transactional, having a laser-like focus on the market and on your customers, bringing good technology to work alongside what you're trying to do. All those things made a difference. But the sort of the intangible alchemy that differentiated those at the top and those at the bottom were all the things we've been talking about. You know, organisations had too many meetings, didn't do so well. People who managed by checklist. You know, managers who were standing over people's shoulders the whole time. All those things, you know, had a damaging impact on performance. This notion of empowerment being something which is, you know, sort of very social workery is not right. I mean, I think, you know, you can be a really empowering manager, but you can do that because you've set really clear objectives and people know exactly what is expected of them and they have the resources to do their job. And that doesn't need, you don't need to be warm and cuddly to do that. But trusting people to get on with it. So you've recruited good people you can trust because they're competent, giving them clarity about what's expected of them and then just backing off. I think is the key thing to all this. And you can do that in a very warm and cuddly and empathetic sort of way. I think people like to feel that they're trusted to do their jobs properly, and they're valued for doing so, and they get good feedback on doing it, so it reinforces that behaviour. I understand why you asked the question, but I don't think we're arguing that successful organisations are like Sunday schools. I think you can be really tough and clear. Clarity is what people want.
Cary?
Well, and even if you look cuddly, a lot of the organizations that look cuddly have all these smoothie days, the well-being days and well-being champions all over the place, and do all that stuff. Is usually covering up something that isn't very effective.
Which is partly why I made my comment about mental health first aid earlier.
Yeah.
Because to be honest, despite what your PhD student said, the HSE, Nottingham University, a whole bunch of other people have basically looked at mental health first aid.
No,
and
I
said
agree with that. Because it's easy.
It doesn't make any difference. People are happy when they come out of the programme, and then 2 weeks later, they're just in the same mess. And I think that the problem about what we're talking about here is you can have all these fruit and Pilates interventions to look after people's well-being, but if they're then going back to jobs that they can't do because they've got heavy workloads, a toxic boss, lots of bullying, and a culture which is lacks trust and transparency, no amount of mental health first aid training or all the other things are going to make any difference.
Mindfulness at lunch, I totally agree with that. If you think about all of our careers, we've always had a line manager. It's that person. It's the critical one in your job. It could look like chaos around the whole goddamn organization. But if you have a good boss, a boss who manages you by praise and reward and recognizes your good work, who allows you to make mistakes, because we all make mistakes, who is aware that you have unmanageable workloads or unrealistic deadlines, or you're suffering, you got a problem at home, right? That kind of person will do the, and if we had a number of those, right, that's what we need. And I remember I got asked a question recently on a big thing I did internationally with a lot of managers. They said, oh God, we've dumped so much on the line manager already. Now you're trying to dump the well-being stuff on this line manager. And my response to that was, if you selected the right person in the first bloody place, you're not doing anything, because that's a part of their personality.
Yeah. So Emma, between chaos and Sunday school, where does your organisation sit? I think that's a continuum we've established now.
We could try and monetize that.
I do think there are many senior managers in the business who are pretty frustrated about some of the initiatives, but what you shouldn't underestimate is the war on talent at the moment. We are all going through a very, very small group of talented people who were all born at a time after I was. And actually, what you need to understand is that to be able to attract and retain these people, they have an expectation of being treated this way. So it isn't always about the business saying, well, this is exactly how we feel we should run. This is about saying, we want to capture this group of talent. We want to keep this group of talent engaged. We want to retain them. This is their expectation. And therefore, we need to kind of be bending and moving so that we are their employer of choice. And also, you spoke in your introduction about the immediacy of feedback these days. We all have that kind of glass door image, which has a direct impact on our ability to recruit new talent. So we need to be putting measures in place so that when people are looking at that type of feedback, they're going, this is a really great place to work. Yeah. So it isn't all necessarily about, well, we believe doing these things will have an immediate impact on improving productivity. It's about saying, this is the talent pool which we're trying to target. How are we going to be their employer of choice? What are they expecting from us? And their expectations are pretty different to when I went and got my first job and what my expectation was of the company I was choosing to work for. And as we become more global in our ability to be employees, that will just continue to become wider and wider. So I don't necessarily disagree with what you're saying, and I've had many conversations with senior managers in my business about this is all just going over the top now, this is all becoming slightly out of hand. And it's like, well, we want to attract that group of people, these are their minimum requirements.
But I was talking to an HR director, said exactly that, of a huge global bank, and you know what he said to me? He said, I said, why are you involved in well-being? You never did this stuff before. And he said, everybody's calling the millennials, the snowflake generation. And you know what they mean by that? They mean they'll shift from one job to another. So for example,
Well, they melt under pressure.
no, not quite the opposite. They won't put up with what their parents put up with, which was a crap job. They won't do that. The millennials will go. A student will come back, an MBA student of mine, 29 years of age, comes back in. This didn't happen too long ago, maybe 9. I can't remember because of the pandemic. But anyway, they came back when I was in. It must have been pre-pandemic, and said to me, "I said, you still working for so and so?" And he said, "Are you joking? I wouldn't. That's a dreadful organization." He's been in 3 organizations since he's done his MBA, and why? He says, because you know what? I got talent. I know I'm good at what I do. I don't want to work in that organization. It's bad work. It's not good work. And this is what the guy from the bank was saying to me. And that's it, precisely it. We want to retain and attract the millennials, that generation.
So Emma, what are you currently doing? Are you yet doing anything different to think about when that cohort of talent becomes sort of the next cohort of leaders? Are you thinking about the leadership positions they might take, or is that too far away just yet?
I think it's still very much just trying to model the values and behaviours that we want to drive forwards. I think it is. I mean, and it's very difficult. And also, what we need to remember is that many years ago, when someone had a bad experience, they could tell 6 people. Now, if someone has a bad experience, they can tell 6 million people very easily. So actually, your reputation, it takes a different battering.
I agree. I'm not arguing to create nasty business. That clearly is where I'm coming from. But the most untapped resource in business is discretionary effort. And sometimes you need pressure to get that discretionary effort. And most of us did our homework on the bus going to school. Most of us have used deadlines to give us that pressure inside of us to do really great work. And I know you're arguing to take that away, but we need to be conscious of the jungle that we're in. You do need people who take a machete and hack their way.
By the way, we're not trying to get rid of pressure, because pressure is stimulating and motivating. The definition of stress is when pressure exceeds your ability to cope.
I agree.
And so, hey, do we want to have people walking in who are extreme, what we call type Bs, who are really totally laid back, highly unmotivated? No, we don't want that. But what we don't want to do is put excessive pressure on them so they don't perform well and they get ill. And for the young people, say, I don't need this, I'm going.
But I think that's also where your reward strategy comes in. You start to identify reward against the behaviours you're trying to encourage. So those people that are doing that extra mile, they are pushing that extra piece, they're rewarded differently. And that means you just have to have a very clear reward strategy. So people that are doing those things benefit from it, and others around them are encouraged to do those things because they can see that benefit. And then by default, looking at the other side, those people that aren't behaving in that way can see they're not being rewarded the same, and therefore are the people that choose to leave. So it's very much driven by reward strategy.
I'll go back to the barn.
I think Tony's got a question.
Thanks, everybody. Has the time come now for big business to learn from sporting management, as sporting management now being the role model in terms of transparency? And they paid their highest players much more than the manager for years and years and years.
That's an interesting one. As long as it's Pep Guardiola, as Man City supporter. Yeah, we don't want to talk about that, do we?
I think that the whole concept of marginal gains from the British cycling team is quite interesting, because that requires you to sort of deconstruct for almost everything and then work out which bits of it, if you did a few bits just that tiny bit better. I suppose what I'm not arguing is a return to business process re-engineering. You remember all that, which has caused loads of stress and hassle and so on, and was regarded just as a way of cutting jobs and so on. But actually, if that's done in a more collective way, where actually everybody's got a role to play, it's almost going back to total quality management and the Japanese system. I did a study for Make UK, which used to be the Engineering Employers Federation, looking at sort of high performance work practices in engineering companies, but mostly medium, small companies, and absolutely looking at this thing that Cary was talking about how work pressure in high performance work practices could improve productivity. And we reckon that because everyone's worried about putting too much pressure on people, if they're under pressure in the right circumstances where they have a say in the way things are done, the way that processes are monitored, they can stop the line if they see a problem and all that sort of stuff. Actually, they can sustain high levels of performance under quite significant pressure for much longer. And we calculated that if more organisations in engineering did that, they could probably raise productivity by about 7 to 9%. So I think there are things around, the way that you deconstruct business processes, manufacturing systems, and so on, and get everyone involved with their ideas to get that built up, and to optimise it. I think that is one of the lessons that I would encourage organisations to think about learning from, the way that British cycling has become so successful.
But if you think about Tony's question, it's an interesting question, because what he's effectively saying is, shouldn't we reward the people who actually perform well?
The superstars.
Given in the United States, you can do that. Funny enough, it's got the culture. I mean, for example, there is no safety net there. We don't have things like redundancy pay in the US at all. Zero. You're gone. If they don't want, if you haven't produced, 2 weeks pay, you're off, right? It's a different culture. So they probably could use that system. They're not also constrained by unions as strongly. They don't have very good employment law, et cetera, et cetera. You can see how the US is the way it is, right? They don't protect the individual and everything else. Could you do that in the context of Europe or say the UK? I think it would be very, very difficult to do that. I mean, I want to see a change in that, and to be able to say to a teacher who's really a great classroom teacher, who's produced some great kids, who's really made a difference, not have to go to the management job because she or doesn't want to really do that, or he. Right? I'd like to see us say, yeah, you know what? You're so good, and here's the evidence you're so good, right? In comparison to other people, and we want to pay you more to stay in that. You don't have to become a head teacher, because that's not what you really want to do. I'd love to do that, but I don't know how we would do that, frankly.
It's the public scrutiny as well of the leadership. I mean, I guess the hairdryer days are now dim and distant, because it's now all over social media. And so our sporting organisations now led by the best managers, who realise that if they make any mistakes, then the whole country is going to be debating it the following day.
Maybe Man United need a hairdryer back.
I was going to say, my point was, I could tell the Manchester affiliation from the quotes you two were using. I want to move away from football, you'll all be pleased to know, just for the last 5 or 10 minutes. And I want to come back to you, Emma, because you start to talk about how you're dealing with people coming in and millennials who have different expectations. Moving on, that sort of broader social and moral agenda, has that changed the way your organisations had to operate or deal with people coming in, new people coming in?
I mean, in terms of the returning to the office piece, I mean, it's just exceptionally complicated, and we are really kind of going through a journey, as I think everybody is. I'm now calling it the inflexible, flexible working.
Well, that's a new one.
Because what we've done, absolutely, is we've really pushed it down. We've done exactly what we should have done. We've told teams that they can look at their roles, look at how it works for them, really think about how often do we need to be together, what activities will we be doing together. We really thought that we were going on the right path, and employees were really happy. What we're starting to find, though, is the employees now have a flexible working schedule which they have set. And now we're starting to come across these barriers where we're having a slowdown of important meetings because, well, I can't do a Tuesday because I don't do Tuesdays, and I don't do a Wednesday. And we're even having this with recruiting managers who are desperately trying to fill their jobs but could only do a face-to-face interview on Tuesdays and Wednesdays because they don't come in on a Thursday. And I think this is a really interesting transition we're about to go through.
Yeah, interesting.
Because as businesses and organisations, we have really tried to get behind the flexible working. But of course, flexible working only works if everybody's flexible.
Yeah, exactly.
And at the moment, we have a situation where employees have an expectation of flexibility on their terms. Yeah. And again, we hear the tabloid press tell us it is the year of the resignation. I hasten to add, we've done a lot of data gathering in our organisation. We have no more resignations at the moment than we would normally expect at this time of year, with the exception of last year when we were in lockdown and people were too scared to move. But of course, the tabloid press tells us that it is the year of the resignation and all these jobs are available, so people have more choice. It tells us they should be able to have all of this flexibility, but they've forgotten about the need to be flexible to their employer as well as the employers need to be flexible to them. And actually, I think this is what's going to be the undoing of what I think is the right way forward, which is a hybrid working model. Because actually some organisations are going to suddenly come across operational difficulties because of the inflexibility of staff who've demanded flexibility.
But that's about a conversation with you as an HR person, with each individual person. I mean, the psychological contract that Steve talked about, it should be this conversation. You and I are having a conversation, and I say to you, I don't want to come in all the time. I'd like to come in maybe a couple days a week. You then say to me, given the nature of your role, that's fine. And then I say to you, I'd want to make it Tuesday and Wednesday. You should then come back to me and say, that's not the way it works. The way it works is you are a part of a team, and your flexibility, two or 3 days, fine, that's okay. But let's work it so that because you're part of a team. So we're going to have to, you can't just say it's Tuesday and Wednesday, because that's inflexible in a way.
Yeah, well, as you said,
but the problem that we
flexible.
have is we have so many dual income households who have responsibilities outside of work which do not have flexibility. Yeah. So actually, for me to have one of my employees come in on a Wednesday, she needs a major negotiation with her husband, because her husband's agreement is that he goes in on a Wednesday, she doesn't go in on a Wednesday, and they've dropped all their childcare and thus saved the cost and the inconvenience. And suddenly they have agreed a new working pattern, which they're perceiving to be flexible working because it's a hybrid working pattern, but it's not flexible really, at all.
For the rest of the team, it's not flexible.
But
and I think this is going to be the unpicking.
Yeah, you're right.
There are three stakeholders in this triangle, and one of them often gets forgotten. I mean, in our organisation, we've done exactly the same thing. We tried to be as accommodating to people's need for flexibility. And then we realised the other day that we've got one person who works on a Friday in one team. So if something happens or a client needs something, or, it's her. And she's not prepared to do it. She's saying the consequence of being so liberal and responsive is that we can't meet our operational requirements. And so actually this is about balancing the needs of an individual, of course, for flexibility, the business's need for flexibility, and the customer's need for flexibility. And sometimes the customer gets left out of all this because customers want to access services 24/7, weekends and so on. So how do you get that sort of sweet spot right so that you sometimes it means saying no. And saying no is fair sometimes because it means you're not going to screw up your ability to meet customer needs just because you want to be overly responsive to your employees. So it's a balancing act and a negotiation, and you have to be really clear what the rules of engagement are.
But I think it is that this is the journey that we're on at the moment, because there is this kind of mix of putting in personal responsibilities and activities outside of work into this mix, which people simply weren't able to do before, is I think
that's
where we're going to really struggle.
What you're saying is that there's a fourth one, the outside, the family,
that's
and
true.
Particularly for young people who have young children. So there's four people in this marriage.
Well, I did some work for PwC a few years ago, and we're looking at graduate entrants, and there was a long list of things that they were expecting in their first job, and top of the list was work-life balance.
Yeah, exactly.
Top of the list. Yeah. And some long in the tooth partners at PwC will say, well, let's do some work first to get the work-life balance. But they'd heard that working in PwC and a similar organisation was tough, and so they were trying to get their defence in first. We're trying to protect themselves against what they knew was going to be sometimes intolerable pressure, and the pressure to be visible, pressure to deliver high quality work and work put a night shift in to meet a client's needs. They knew that was going to happen, but they were trying to protect themselves by making sure they were putting in a call for work-life balance early on.
I had a really difficult conversation with our Tokyo office the other day, because they had worked out that because they have very long commutes in Tokyo, they've worked out if they work from home, they can do an extra 5 hours a day if they do 2.5 hours each way commute. So they had a wonderful idea that at certain times of the month they would work exceptionally long hours, which were the peak of the month. So you could argue as a business, that's a really great idea. We get more of them at the time of the month when we need them more. And then they would just take kind of other bits of the month off. And the reason why I was pushing back quite hard is because I was saying, well, when are you going to have your thinking time? When are you going to have your headspace? When are you going to have your development time? Because at the moment, in those lows of the month, that's when we're investing in your development, your progression, and you're thinking a little bit more strategically, and you've got some space. Whereas they were just thinking about, well, today I can do a lot of hours at this time of the month, and I just won't work the rest of the month. And I had a real concern about the impact on their development, because they were just removing what they consider to be empty time, but it's probably the time when they have all of their ideas and their creativity and they collaborate with other teams, and they were just looking to kind of erase it to get what they perceive to be a work-life balance.
Yes. But you raised the issue, and that's the important thing. You raised the issue with them.
Hasn't made them popular.
That's what human resource management should be about, rather than personnel. We're in HR. If HR is HR, I'm afraid, guys and gals, as HR people, you got a lot of work on now. It's not, this negotiation process is not going to be easy. It's going to be difficult.
It is really tough.
But you have to be honest. And from your perspective, you say, I'm representing the employer. And I think here's the downside of what you just said. You have to be honest about that. And that's how you get the negotiation sorted.
One of the best ways of doing this, is self-managed teams. And we should bring all the stuff from years ago, the Colmar plant in Volvo and stuff like that. Teams themselves should be accountable for knowing what their delivery is and work out their schedules to meet their delivery.
By the way, that's not a bad idea.
I'll disagree with Cary. Asking the HR director to sit there and pull all the levers is not the way to do it.
Oh, no, I agree with your self-managing teams. I like that idea.
I'm sorry, I interrupted.
But it's great if you've got great managers.
Yeah,
that's exactly right. It's a great manager.
So you essentially find that you're filling in for those managers that don't have the EQ or don't have the experience?
You do, or sometimes you're filling it. What you tend to find is the really good, strong managers end up managing their teams in a way that the teams perceive as less fair than the weaker manager, who actually is just going for the easy ride. So you end up in a situation where sometimes the engagement levels of the stronger managers can drop, because they feel as though in the short term, maybe not the long term, they feel in the short term as though they're not being given the same flexibility, because the weaker managers just aren't managing it.
Let's just get back to work.
We have one last question, and then I think we are up on time. So go on, make it a good one, Martin.
No pressure then. Pre-pandemic, organisations looked at culture as being, it was a buzzword and it's been going around for a long time, and this is what it means to be working with us, and links into discretionary effort as well, and leadership development, all that sort of good stuff. There's been a noticeable shift in listening to this as well, with where we are now and where we're going, that culture has been given a real shake-up in organisations. And when you look at people coming into an organisation, and I'll take myself for an example, when I started right at the beginning of the pandemic here, I hadn't met anyone. So my culture, my understanding of Armstrong Craven was my own little bubble, for instance. So how impactful is that change in culture and contracting with your employees? How is that changing, and where do we need to be going with culture within organisations?
I think it's partly about meaning and purpose. I think, and I know a lot of people talk about that, and with a degree of cynicism. I did see an organisation that was recruiting a chief meaning officer, for example, which is just one step down from a laughter manager, which I've also seen.
Chief happiness officer.
Yeah, all that sort of stuff. So quite a few of those. But I think, particularly in knowledge-based organisations, where your competitive advantage is based on your ability to curate and get knowledge and know-how and so on. I think it is partly to do with culture and values and so on, but I think the thing that binds, you've got to identify the thing that binds people together and gives them that sense of collective purpose. I agree with the idea about self-managed teams. I think that's exactly the opposite to the sort of hero model of leadership that we've been reliant on too much, and perhaps is too much prevalent in the sporting world. So I think there is something about finding what that irreducible core of purpose of your organisation is, that gives people, that animates people to give discretionary effort, that is an articulation of what we're all here to do. We've all got our tasks and our deadlines and so on, but above all that is some sense that we're all here to make this difference in the world. And that doesn't need to necessarily be a highfalutin thing. It's about, the thing that binds you all together to get you up every day and to make sure that you are giving of your best the whole time. And that should be automatic. To be part of this organisation, you get it in companies like Microsoft, because as soon as you walk through the door, there's a sort of way of doing things and a way of being that is acceptable, and which goes way above, the sort of articles of association or your business purpose. It's something that binds you as individuals together. And I think that's the future of this, that goes beyond, sort of fairly trite definitions of what culture might be.
I think that is a very good place to end. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody.